Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. It's so great to have you all here. You're welcome to the third Human Animal Interactions Conference in Africa. We've had 2 editions so far in 2021 and 2022, and they were fantastic. And I'm sure that this would be nothing short of that. So thank you so much for making out the time. Thank you so much for signing up. As at the last count, we had 530 people sign up from 40 countries. So thank you so much for being able to make out the time to be here, each and every one of you. We will be starting the event immediately. And just to say that the event for this year is centered around 2 themes that build together. And the first is empathy, building empathy in humans by tapping into the emotions and all of that animals could equally help us to build. So that's one of the major advantages that HAI has been able to help us humans with. And the second thing that we are building the conference this year around as well is that of the link. And the link, because it's equally important to carry on the to have the animals in mind as well. And the link basically is something that I would leave that to the experts, if I put it that way, to talk about more about the link much later on. But it basically is another way of saying that people who commit deliberate acts of violence, of cruelty to animals could also possibly, could have the possibility as well of committing crimes or violence, interpersonal violence as well. So the conference for this year is built around those 2 themes. A few quick announcements before we continue for the conference today. First of all, please make use of the chat box to tell us where you're joining us from. We have a number of people already indicating where they're joining us from in the chat box. We have people already on the call from Ethiopia, Kenya, Botswana, Nigeria, Canada, and the likes. So please share with us where you are joining us from in the chat box. At the same time, please take note of the fact that your name, the name that already is on the Zoom account that you're using right now, would really go a long way to helping us when we are sorting out the certificates. So please do ensure that the name on your Zoom account right now is the same name that does appear on the sign-up form that you did sign up with earlier. If it's not, please try to rename so that when we are trying to collate, it will be easy for us to be able to know who it is, since Zoom would not give us the email addresses for people that attended, but would only give us the names. So that said, I would equally want to encourage everyone who is here to share with us in the chat box relevant events, relevant links, or things that you feel will be relevant to the conversations as the conversations go on as well in the chat box. Over the years, the chat box has been a strong resource for getting information, quite vital information over the years. This entire event is currently being recorded as well, and the recording will be sent for everyone who signed up using the sign-up sheets earlier. And finally, we have 2 alternate hosts. Okay, well, is the second person here? Anyways, so we have alternate hosts for this event. And what that just means is we have people who, in case my internet does go haywire at any point in my internet in Nigeria and all of that, you would expect that they would step up on my behalf to continue the proceedings of the event before I am able to get back in. So I would want to introduce my alternate host for today so that we know who to expect in case you don't see me, to know who you're expected to see. So the alternate host for today is Praise Akobo. She's someone who works to close the gap in literacy and empowerment of youth with disabilities in rural environments in Nigeria, beginning with Benue State and all of that. She loves to facilitate reading development as well in a supportive environment with the assistance of therapy dogs and all of that. So please make welcome Praise Akobo for as the alternate speaker. Praise, can you just please introduce yourself briefly? Or just so that people can see you and know who they are expected to see.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Dr. Sunday. It's a pleasure being here. And of course, it's also great to serve as an alternate host. Thank you very much. Thank you to the speakers that are already on ground.
Okay, fantastic. So with that, we will be moving straight to the presentations for today. And our first speaker, our case presenter for today is someone who is an esthetician. She is an entrepreneur, she's a chef, and she's the founder of Excel Secrets. She's a healthy skincare product. She owns a healthy skincare products and spa in Lagos, Nigeria. She's equally a dog mom who recently witnessed the horrific passing of emotional support dog Roxy, a well-trained and well-socialized American bully puppy in an unjustifiable act of animal cruelty. The event trended in Nigeria and the UK for weeks with the hashtag Justice for Roxy. Her book, Roxy, The Tale of a Bully, is available on Amazon Kindle, which we'll talk more about what she will share with us here today, and also available on seller.co in ebook formats, as well as available in paperback. So for the case presentation to kick off the event for today, please make welcome Esther Okoli. So Esther, over to you.
Good day, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Sunday. Thank you for bringing me on board. I really appreciate being here. So the story of Roxy is a very sad one. It's a very sad one. Roxy was a loyal and loving pet to my family. One day she strayed bring her back home. It's a really hard topic to discuss. We were only left to fight for justice for Roxy. The case of Roxy is a powerful reminder of the bond between humans and animals and the devastating impact of cruelty. It's just sad that in this part of the world, nobody regards animals. Most people see them as just food to be eaten, you know. But these animals, especially dogs, they serve as companions to us. For someone like me, I've lived all my life with dogs. I live with about 5 dogs in the house. I literally call them my children. I mean, all of us here were dog lovers. You should know what I'm talking about. So imagine someone killing your child in front of you. It's terrible. Can you park the car? It's terrible. So we've been trying to fight for justice since March, and up to now, nothing has been done. Me along the whole dog society dog association thing. I'm sorry, the network is bad. I just have to park right now. So I hope that the story of Roxy inspires us all to take action against animal cruelty, especially in Nigeria. Hi, can anyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I really hope that the story of Roxy inspires us all. And the story of Roxy is, like Dr. Sunday said, it's online on Amazon. You can get the story there. You can read all about it there. So thank you very much, Dr. Sunday, again for this opportunity. I hope tomorrow and the next day I'll be able to make it in time for the conference.
Okay, so thank you so much. Thank you so much, Esther. So well, Esther is a bit, do I say, unstable at the moment, based on the fact that she's caught up in traffic and everything, which is quite irregular in Nigeria, where she lives in Lagos, Nigeria. So thank you so much. Well, let me not go take a deep dive into the story, but then to just share a little bit, she had Roxy coming into the family then at a point where she was going through some issues and then having or experiencing some level of depression at the time, and then got in Roxy as a dog or a companion then to help her through the period. And Roxy did a fantastic job at that before that fateful day in this year when Roxy was killed in the estate for unjustifiable reasons and everything, just because he wandered off into someone else's compound without causing harm to anyone in the house. And so, like we said earlier, we are bringing animal welfare as well into the forefront for this conference, especially because we have largely an African audience, to equally say yes. The message of human-animal interactions is basically to let us know that animals, we can benefit a lot from our interaction with animals, but at the same time, it does equally mean that we need to uphold animal welfare. And I do hope that over time, this helps us to see animals not just as objects for food or as such, but then to now see animals as companions and as beings that we need to pay attention to as well. So thank you so much, Esther. And we will be moving straight to the first speaker, first speaker for today's conference. And the first speaker is an emeritus professor of animal welfare at the School of Veterinary Medicine, University of Pennsylvania. His research focuses on the behavior and welfare of dogs, cats, human attitudes to animals, and the history and psychology of human-animal relations and interactions. He has published more than 200 articles and book chapters on this and related topics. And he's the author, editor, or co-editor of several books, including Animals and Human Society, Changing Perspectives, In the Company of Animals, Companion Animals and Us, and The Domestic Dog. He's also the creator of the widely used Canine Behavioral Assessment and Research Questionnaire, CBARC. So please make welcome the first speaker for the conference for today to speak on the topic, developing compassion for animals through relationship with pets. So please make welcome Professor James Serpell.
Thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak to you today. As the doctor said, my background is in research, and I will be telling you about some research findings. I'll try and keep it simple, but maybe at the end of my presentation, if there's any questions, people can share those with me, and I'm happy to try and clarify anything that is hard to understand. But let me just share my screen. Okay. Can people see that?
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay. Just minimize that. All right. So yes, today I'm going to try and talk to you a bit about a topic that I find very interesting, and I hope you'll find interesting, which is the idea that people can develop a more caring and compassionate view of other animals through relationships with their pets, through their relationships with companion animals in particular. Sorry, I'm gonna move this forward. Before getting into that, I want to just raise this concept of One Health. The idea of One Health is pretty old now. It goes back about 30 years. And it arose out of a recognition that human health and animal health are not separate domains, even though we have medical doctors and veterinary doctors to address humans or animals respectively. the One Health concept recognizes that actually there's a huge amount of overlap between those two, and that just at, at the simplest level, many of the diseases that afflict humans have come from other animals, so there's this sort of very large area of overlap, and that both human and animal health are also equally influenced by their shared environment. So the One Health concept is this kind of umbrella term, literally here, that recognizes these interconnections between people and animals, plants, and their shared environment. More recently, people have switched, or some people have switched from talking about One Health to talking about One Welfare. And One Welfare, again, is this kind of umbrella concept. But it is a broader concept than simply health. So health is a component of welfare. Obviously, if we're unhealthy, our welfare is affected badly. But there are other aspects to welfare that aren't necessarily just to do with health. And again, this One Welfare concept is all about recognizing these interconnections and interdependencies between animals and humans and the environment we live in. I notice here that right up at the top here, under this umbrella is the concept of animal and human abuse, which is something that's going to be talked about a lot by other speakers at this conference. Before sort of going on, I just want to kind of clarify what we mean by the term welfare here. So in the Oxford English Dictionary, the word welfare is defined as the state of faring or doing well, which is a pretty simple, straightforward definition. We know when someone's doing well or when our pets are doing well. We even know when ecosystems are doing well or whether they're doing badly, that type of thing. But as scientists, we want to be able to measure that. We want to be able to describe it in terms that we can measure. And generally, when scientists get together to talk about welfare, they focus on a number of things. One of the important things they focus on is the presence of what are perceived to be unpleasant feelings or emotional states. So things like pain, nausea, fear, distress, frustration, suffering, and so on. All of these sort of unpleasant emotional states that are said to be characteristic of an individual who's experiencing poor welfare. Other scientists have also pointed out that it's not, that welfare is a sort of, is a one-dimensional thing, but it goes from very poor to very good. And so we can't ignore good feelings as well, pleasant feelings and emotional states, so-called positive welfare. So at one end of the extreme, you could have a preponderance of unpleasant feelings or emotional states. And at the other extreme, you could be in a state of good welfare and have a lot of pleasant feelings and emotional states. And then thirdly is this idea of animals and people having interests in expressing normal behavior, normal species typical behavior. And if we thwart that ability, if we prevent animals or people from doing what comes naturally, so to speak, to them in terms of behavior, then they experience frustration. They experience other kinds of negative emotional states and unpleasant feelings. And this has given rise to something that's called the sort of balance or the feelings model of animal welfare, where you can kind of imagine an individual's welfare being like this weighing machine, and good welfare is when the pleasant feelings outweigh the unpleasant ones, and poor welfare, conversely, is when the unpleasant feelings overwhelm the pleasant feelings in your life, and you're experiencing poor welfare at that point. Sorry, was somebody talking there? I don't know. The only problem with that sort of feelings model of animal welfare is that it really can't accommodate the the environment, the natural environment. The natural environment doesn't have feelings or emotions, as far as we know, because it's not sentient. And here, when you're talking about nature, another issue is to consider the ability of entities, whether they're animals or humans or natural ecosystems, to consider their ability to cope or not cope with the kinds of things that happen to them, the sort of demands that are placed on them. And with animals and with people, you know, clearly we recognize that some situations stress us. We find them very stressful, and we find them stressful because they're overwhelming our ability to cope, overwhelming our ability to adapt to them. And similarly, we can talk about ecosystems being stressed because of the things that are being done to them by outside forces, where they lose a kind of sustainability, they lose their homeostasis, their ability to balance over time due to the pressures that are exerted on them from outside forces. So in that sense, we can talk about the welfare of the environment, but think of it really in terms of this ability of the environment to cope with the kinds of demands that are made on it. And we can sort of represent all of this in a nice sort of triangular pictorial diagram here, where this concept of one welfare involves the welfare of humans, other animals, and the environment all being kind of interconnected and interdependent. So you've got human welfare and well-being here, with human health a component of that welfare and well-being. Similarly, with animals, you have animal welfare and animal health. And down here with the environment, you have things like biodiversity, homeostasis, and what you could call environmental health, which certainly people recognize when they see an unhealthy ecosystem, when it's out of balance and not functioning properly. So I just go back a bit. It's important to think that that these interconnections and interdependencies are both positive and negative. So we can think of many examples where these connections are very positive. A good one would be an example of a lot of recent research which has focused on the benefits that humans derive from keeping companion animals, from keeping pets. So effects on people's health, both physical and mental health, and their overall well-being as a result of keeping pets. One study, there are obviously many research studies in this area, but one study I particularly like is this quite old one from 1998 from New Zealand. And in this study, they asked pet owners to complete various measures of their physical and their mental health. But they also asked them to describe how compatible they considered their relationship was with their pets. And it turned out at the end of the study, when they analyzed the results, that the pet owners who reported very high levels of what they call behavioral compatibility between themselves and their pets experienced better overall mental health, enhanced feelings of well-being, less distress, more positive emotional affect, less anxiety, and also fewer physical symptoms of ill health than people who reported less behavioral compatibility between themselves and their pets. And these effects were independent of other factors, such as the amount of human social support they were getting in their lives. And what I really like about this is that it suggests that, you know, pet ownership isn't always going to be beneficial for people. It's much more like a marriage. If you have a good marriage, a compatible marriage with another individual who meets your needs and fulfills your goals for that relationship, then that's going to be mutually beneficial for both of those involved. But if you have a problem there where, for example, the behavior of the pet just doesn't fit your needs, or you have unrealistic expectations of the pet, then it's not going to work so well, and you're unlikely to experience the same kind of benefits. And this probably also applies to in the area of animal-assisted therapy. So there have been many, many studies in the field of animal-assisted therapy, but very conflicting results. Some studies have shown dramatic benefits from these types of interactions with animals, and other studies have found no benefits. And again, it suggests to me that, you know, not every therapy animal and every therapy animal situation is going to work as well, because it depends both on the person and their expectations and the animal and how well the animal is doing its job, so to speak, in the therapeutic context. We can also see evidence for this type of thing at the level of human physiology and animal physiology. So this was another study done much later in 2012 in Sweden, and they looked at the so-called bonding hormone, oxytocin, in the blood of people who were interacting with their dogs. And they looked at it not only in the owner's blood, but also in the dog's blood. And they were able to see very instantaneous changes in these levels of oxytocin. We know that when people are experiencing a surge in oxytocin, they feel very good. It's a very rewarding sensation, having this oxytocin surge. And it also suppresses the stress response. So all round, you know, having a surge in oxytocin levels is a good thing for you. And they asked the people who participated in this study also to complete something called the Monash dog owner relationship scale, which is a sort of general measure of how good the quality of the relationship is between the owner and the dog. And what they found was, this was an experimental setup there. They implanted catheters in the veins of both the people and the dogs, so they could extract blood at intervals without interrupting or causing any discomfort to the individuals. And they asked them to interact. And this just shows the oxytocin levels immediately after they started to interact. Here's sort of 1 minute, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 15 minutes, and so on. And you can see that both the dog is the blue line and the yellow line is the human. In both the dog and the human, oxytocin levels go up in that first 3 minutes after they start to interact, and then they start to come down again to the sort of baseline levels. The oxytocin response in dogs is much more extreme than it is in humans, which is a pity because they put them both on the same chart, but actually this is quite a big increase for humans. What is striking about this study is that both the dogs and the owner's oxytocin levels were positively correlated. So if the owner showed a strong response in oxytocin, so did the dog. So the two, as it were very closely matched to each other. Also, it turned out when they analyzed the results from this Monash dog owner relationship scale, that owners, they found that dogs and owners' oxytocin levels were both positively correlated with how often the owners reported kissing their dogs. So I think the take-home message is here, these affectionate interactions between the person and the dog were one of the things that were key to triggering this oxytocin surge. So you can imagine if you had a rather unaffectionate dog, one that didn't really like to be kissed or whatever, you might not experience the same kind of benefit. And the other interesting finding was that owners' perceptions of the costs of dog ownership, which is something that this MDAWS scale measures, were negatively associated with the dog's oxytocin levels. So if the owner perceived the dog ownership as being costly and less beneficial, then the dog responded by having lower oxytocin levels, which is kind of intriguing. But again, it emphasizes this close meshing, as it were, complementarity between the owner and the animal. But of course, not all, as I said, relationships between humans and their pets are necessarily positive ones. So we know of many negative impacts that pet keeping has. There are a lot of public health risks associated with pet keeping. So animal bites and scratches, zoonoses, these are diseases transmitted from animals to people. Accidental injuries caused by pet animals. So the Centers for Disease Control in the United States has reported that up to 800,000 people in the US require medical attention each year for dog bites. So that's not an insignificant negative impact of pet keeping on people. And there's also environmental damage from pet keeping. So there's the fouling of public and natural areas. There's the potential for noise pollution from dogs barking. Free roaming pets can cause predation on wildlife, or they can hybridize with their wild relatives and sort of damage the genetic integrity of sometimes endangered wild species. And the exotic pet trade, the trade in exotic animals from predominantly areas in the global south to Western countries, can cause tremendous loss of biodiversity due to the sort of capture and export of these animals to foreign countries. So there are certainly also negative impacts of pet keeping, and there are negative impacts of people on their pets. So the one you'll be hearing a lot more about at this conference is what I call the cruelty connection, or sometimes the link. In other words, the concept of a link between animal abuse and other forms of violent and antisocial behavior. And this concept of the link, as I'm sure you will learn, has a very long history. This illustration here is from the 18th century, nearly 300 years ago, produced by William Hogarth, an English artist, illustrating the kind of casual cruelty that he witnessed on the streets of London back in the 18th century, with people, this man clubbing a carriage horse that's fallen down, and another guy here sort of bludgeoning a sheep to death, and so on. And in the background, we have a child being run over by a cart. So this is a kind of, the connection he's drawing is pretty obvious. He's saying, when we turn a blind eye to this sort of cruelty, we end up with a society that is desensitized to this kind of thing. But I really want to talk today about the opposite side of this kind of coin, which is the notion that pet keeping may be able to promote compassion for other animals or nature. This idea, at least from a sort of historical perspective, doesn't have such a long pedigree, but it is well recognized within the animal protection community. So this is just a quote from Dr. Randall Lockwood at the ASPCA, who said that caring for and about dogs and cats is a primary portal to compassion and concern about a wide array of animal protection issues. And here he's recognizing the fact that many of the people who support animal protection in the United States, who give money, who participate in funding drives and so on, are pet owners, people who live with companion animals, and this experience of living with companion animals is helping to generate compassion and concern for animal-related issues. But where is the evidence? And the reality is that we don't have a tremendous amount of evidence, but we do have a few studies that are, I think, quite, in some ways, inspiring and important. Well, one which I want to talk about particularly was done by a graduate student of mine way back in the early part of the 1990s. This study was done by Elizabeth Paul, and she was interested in interviewing students at the university where we were based to ask them about their histories of pet ownership. She was just interested in how this sort of early history of childhood pet ownership might influence attitudes to animals. So she interviewed a total of 385 students. She gave them various surveys to complete. One of them was a survey called the Pet Attitude Scale that, as it suggests, measures students' attitudes to companion animals, pet animals like dogs and cats. And then another survey was the scale of attitudes towards the treatment of animals by Templer, which looked at students' attitudes towards harmful treatment of things like farm animals or wild animals or laboratory animals, animals used for research. And then she also asked these students about the number of pets that they had personally owned during childhood. And I think she defined childhood here as anything from sort of 0 to 16 years of age. The number of pets owned by the family during childhood, and the number of pets that the students reported as being particularly important to them. And this was defined as any pets that were important to you in some way during childhood. But the sort of the background to that was the assumption that these were the pets with which these students were particularly attached. And what's interesting here is these are correlation coefficients, so they're just showing the level of association. And what you see very clearly is that when it comes to the important pets, the number of important pets owned during childhood, these students are reporting much higher scores on the pet attitude scale, and interestingly, on all these other animal attitude scales. Now, you'd expect there'd be a correlation here between having lots of important pets in childhood and having a positive attitude to pet animals. But at the time, it was not expected that we'd find these correlations with attitudes to other categories of animals, like farm animals and wild animals and laboratory animals. So there was a suggestion here that this experience of growing up with pets, especially important pets, could generalize, not just affecting your attitude to other pet animals, but to all kinds of animals across the board. This just shows some of these effects in a sort of graphic form. So this, we have the number of family pets owned in childhood along the bottom here, ranging from none up to 8 or more pets. And this is the number of subjects, the proportion of subjects, the percent of subjects who reported supporting animal protection organizations, either through financially or through some kind of membership. And what you can see is there is a strong linear correlation there with a correlation coefficient of 0.84. That's very highly statistically significant. So the more pets they had in childhood, the more likely they were as adults to support animal protection causes. So this is a confirmation of what Randall Lockwood was talking about in that statement I introduced a bit earlier. A clear demonstration. Interestingly, it didn't just extend to animal protection, it also extended to support for environmental and conservation organizations in adulthood. The correlation isn't as strong, it's much weaker, but it's still there with a correlation coefficient of 0.7. So this suggests also that not only does pet keeping affect attitudes to pets, it affects attitudes to other categories of animals, it affects attitudes to causes that animal protection organizations focus on, and it also extends to some degree to concern for the environment. And another interesting finding was that there was a relationship between pet attachment, the number of important pets that these kids reported during childhood, and their tendency in later life to avoid animal-based foods. In other words, to not necessarily be vegetarian, but to avoid some kind of animal-derived food product, and that might be veal or eggs from caged chickens, free-range meat, this type of thing, some kind of evidence that they were making ethical choices about what they were eating, these subjects. And what was interesting is that if you just had none or just one important pet in childhood, it didn't seem to make any difference. These two were the same, but it suddenly jumped up to 45% of these students reporting some kind of ethical food-related behavior when they had two or more of these important pets during childhood. This particular aspect of the study has since been replicated in a study by Roth, Gerber, and Mikan in 2014. And they found exactly the same effect. In other words, they found a strong relationship between pet attachment and the tendency to avoid eating meat of some kind. And this was a much larger population of adults, not just students. But what was interesting was that they inserted here a measure of empathy towards animals in their study. And what they found was that when they considered this in a kind of what they call a mediation model, this association disappeared. In other words, the mechanism for this relationship between pet attachment and meat avoidance went through empathy. And the implication here is that pet attachment leads to a sense of empathy towards animals. And it's this empathy towards animals that leads then to many of these adults avoiding meat of some kind. Interestingly, this relationship between pet keeping and empathy does not necessarily extend to other humans. So this is another study by Elizabeth Paul conducted in 2000. She compared pet owners and non-owners and asked them to complete two different empathy scales. One was a measure of empathy for animals, and the other was a measure of empathy just for people. And what they found was that when they looked at the animal empathy scale, the pet owners were scoring much higher than the non-pet owners. But when you looked at the human empathy scale, there was really no difference between the two groups. So the implication is it's this exposure to pets that is changing things, that is increasing this empathy and then subsequently increasing behavior. Finally, I just wanted to show you this very recent study that came out in 2021. This was an interesting kind of study where they asked children and adults. So I think there were 222 adults and 207 children. The children all in the age range of 5 to 9 years old. And they presented these people with a kind of hypothetical ethical dilemma, which is they called the sinking boats dilemma. And in the sinking boats dilemma, you have two boats which are sinking, but you can only rescue the contents of one of the boats in the dilemma. And you have to say which boat you would rescue. And here are the options. So up at the top here, we have humans versus dogs. And these are just the children up here. And the dilemma is you've got a boat with one human in it versus a boat with 100 dogs. Who do you save? Which boat do you save? At the other end of the spectrum, you've got a boat with one dog in it versus a boat with 100 humans in it. And the question is, which do you save? And it's very obvious here that the children often will save the dogs in preference to the humans. The red areas are sort of undecided. The children couldn't decide which to save. By the time you get up here where they're saving 100 humans and allowing one dog to drown, clearly they're favoring humans, but there's still quite a proportion of them that would still rather save the dog than the humans. When you get to the adults who are down here, clearly it's much more biased towards saving humans. Although down at this end, where it's 1 human versus 100 dogs, quite a lot of people would save the boat containing 100 dogs. What's kind of interesting about this is that the children, well, clearly exhibited a much stronger tendency to prioritize saving the animals over the humans. They had another scenario in which it was pigs rather than dogs. And the children and the adults both preferred to save the dogs than to save the pigs. But this tendency of children and adults to prioritize saving animals over humans was very strongly predicted by their prior exposure to pet dogs. So again, it appears that the children who lived with dogs as family pets were much more likely to show this type of response than the children who had no family pets at home. That just shows that result down here. Regular dog pet exposure, a highly significant effect for the children, a significant effect for the adults, but not so strong. So by the time you get to being adult, you know, you've been acculturated with the notion that humans are much more important than dogs, and therefore you're much more likely to rescue the humans, even when you could potentially rescue many more dogs. And this has given rise, these types of studies have given rise to something that has been dubbed the animal ambassador hypothesis. And that is the notion that companion animals, pet animals, or certain animals that you keep as social companions can serve as kind of ambassadors for other animals in general. So growing up with particular animals as family members, as pets, during childhood, we find predicts adult pet ownership and also empathy for animals. And it also promotes more caring, compassionate attitudes and more opposition to actions that are perceived to be harmful to animals. And what's really interesting is that the effect seems to be dose dependent. In other words, the more pets kept in childhood and the stronger the attachments that people have for those pets, the stronger the effect and the greater likelihood that it will generalize to species other than the ones kept as pets. And since caring for animals also involves caring for things that matter to animals, this could then lead to caring for, say, the animal's natural habitat, its natural environment, or the ecosystem in which it lives, that type of thing. So you get this kind of generalization occurring. And I've represented that diagrammatically here. So we have attachment to pets occurring here between people and their pets. That leads to empathy, initially for companion animals, but over time, generalizing to empathy for all sorts of other categories of animals. And so these pets are acting as ambassadors for all these other kinds of animals. And that this empathy for other animals inevitably leads to concern about those animals' natural habitats, where they live, and threats to those habitats. Of course, a lot of this is still hypothesis. The research findings don't provide a lot of evidence for causation, causality. It could be, for example, that the kinds of people who develop strong empathy for animals or animal habitats are also the kinds of people who get pets, in which case the empathy preceded the pet keeping. It's going to be hard to tease out these causal effects. It's also possible that children in particular are affected by their parental attitudes, and nobody's really investigated that in any detail, although we certainly know that parents' attitudes are very much reflected in the attitudes of their children. But I guess I would say that if it is a parental effect, it still begs the question where the parents got their attitudes from. So it's really sort of just deferring the problem backwards. I think there's certainly enough evidence there to encourage more research in this area. And I think some of the questions that need to be addressed are things like to what extent does this empathy towards companion animal species truly extend to other categories of animals, particularly wildlife and their habitats? Another important question is whether there are what you might call critical periods in child development when these pet attachments have the greatest impact on the development of empathy and attitudes. Another question is how is this tendency for empathy to generalize from companion animals to other species affected by the types and diversity of pets kept in childhood? If you only ever have a dog in childhood, maybe that doesn't generalize very well. But if you have a whole series of animals ranging from dogs to birds to snakes, then maybe that's more likely to make this sense of empathy generalize. Also, as I mentioned, how is all of this affected by things like parental attitudes and sort of modeling behavior? And how is it affected by things like the numbers and ages of one's siblings, or by one's personality, all kinds of sort of aspects of individuals that might affect this tendency to empathize with other species. So just to summarize, the health and welfare of humans, non-human animals, and the natural environment are all interconnected and interdependent. And the one welfare concept or the one health concept is a useful way of thinking about this sort of interdependency. Pet keeping, we know, can certainly have negative effects on people, other animals, and the natural environment, but current evidence suggests that pet keeping, especially during childhood, can also help to promote the development of more empathic and caring views of animals in the natural world. And if you ask, why does this matter? I think the answer is here. We are in the middle of a biodiversity crisis in the world. This is a quote from Sir David Attenborough in the foreword to a recent book called The Economics of Biodiversity. And he says, today, we ourselves, together with the livestock we rear for food, constitute 96% of the mass of all mammals on the planet. Only 4% is everything else, and that includes everything from elephants to badgers, from moose to monkeys. 70% of all the birds alive at this moment are domestic poultry, mostly chickens for us to eat. We are destroying biodiversity, the very characteristic that until recently enabled the natural world to flourish so abundantly. If we continue this damage, whole ecosystems will collapse. And when they collapse, that will lead to the collapse of human societies as well. So this is an urgent crisis, desperately urgent crisis, and any kind of intervention that could help to stem, this collapse is critically important to our survival as well as the survival of other species and the natural world. So, I don't want to over-exaggerate the benefits of pet keeping, but I don't think we should ignore them either. That one of these benefits may well be its impact on how we think about other species and natural systems. And I hope there's enough time left for you to address some questions here. Should be, I don't know. Now, let me get out of this.
Hey, thank you so much. I loved a few things that you said, and I did take note of them. One of which is that the more pets one had in childhood, the more likely to embrace animal welfare in adulthood. I think in a way that sums up my story and everything. Growing up, my father made sure we always had at least one dog in our family. And then this particular dog that my father's friend traveled to the UK, imported and brought them, that dog changed our lives forever, Skipper. So for me, that was how it was easy for me to transition into everything. But today is not Skipper's day, so let me leave that out of it for now. So if you do have questions, we are almost out of time already, just 2 more minutes to the next presentation. But if you do have questions, please just share in the chat box, and then we'll probably take 2 questions. And then while waiting on that, I would probably ask one of the questions from the pre-conference questions that were sent in earlier. So someone, Catherine from the UK was asking, and then she asked, what are critical points that we should take note of to ensure our service, working and therapy animals needs are met and consistently considered throughout whilst working? Did you hear the question? Hi, James, did you hear the question? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, so did you hear the question I just asked?
Yeah, can you say it again?
Okay, so so Catherine was asking from, so she asked, let me see. Okay, yes, so she said, what are the critical points that we should take note of to ensure our service, working and therapy animals needs are met and consistently considered whilst working? So the critical points to take note of to ensure that the animals needs are met whilst working.
Yeah, I think probably the most obvious thing is to use animals that very clearly enjoy the work. So they are eager to participate in the therapy program. They are very responsive to social engagement with people. And they appear to be happy, you know, they appear to really enjoy this type of activity. I mean, I've seen too often people engage in animal-assisted therapy with dogs that sometimes they're too old, or sometimes they're just not interested. And sometimes they're actually made a bit anxious by the activity because there are so many people crowding around them and wanting to get their attention. And this isn't an activity that all dogs enjoy, is the truth of the matter. But I think if you focus on the animals that really like this type of activity, that really get a lot out of it and enjoy the social engagement, then probably that's the best guarantee that you're going to produce a positive experience for the people as well. And I think that's very critical.
Okay, thank you so much. So there are two other questions that are in the chat currently. I would probably just give both together so that after that we can now move to the next speaker. So the first question is by Dr. Isa Amiru from Nigeria, and he asks, can we call it beneficial to the ecosystem for humans not to consume meat? So that's the first question. And then the second question is, okay. Is there any study about the use of therapy dogs in the treatment of autistic children? So now 3 questions. So we'll probably just ask. Then the final question is there any study? Okay, no, sorry. Should pet and child socializations be incorporated into a child's upcoming education? So did you get the 3 questions?
Yeah. Okay. Well, as for the meat eating, the evidence suggests that eating meat is actually bad for the environment. It's pretty unequivocal. Some forms of meat are worse than others. So beef is about as bad as you can get. Chicken's not so bad. But yes, generally speaking, eating meat is not good for the environment. In terms of should pet and child socialization be incorporated into a child's upcoming education? Well, I think it very much depends on the context. So yes, by all means, introduce pet keeping to child socialization at an early age in education, if it's possible to do it in a way that's, humane and safe for the children. I think the more contact that you can give children with animals in a positive setting, that gives them the opportunity to both interact with the animals in a positive way and learn about the animals and learn to trust their perceptions of the animals and so on. That's got to be a positive thing. So yes, I would recommend it in general. And yes, there are studies about the use of therapy dogs in the treatment of autistic children. There's actually studies also looking at small animals like guinea pigs with autistic children. And in some cases, these studies have found quite profound benefits. So there is research out there.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so very much.
You're welcome.
For the outstanding presentation. A few people or some people have commented in the chat box to share how much they have enjoyed listening to the presentation. So Suzanne Leroux, for example, says, thank you, Professor Soppel, fantastic presentation and very informative. So thank you so much. We will now be moving to the next speaker for the conference. And the next speaker is someone who is an acclaimed lecturer, author, and educator. He's the coordinator of the National Link Coalition, the National Resource Center on the link between animal abuse and human violence, and he edits the monthly Link letter. He equally co-founded the National Link Coalition, the National Animal Control Association, and the Colorado and New Jersey Humane Federations. He has served with the AVMA, the ASPCA, American Humane, the Delta Society, Animals and Society Institutes, and a whole lot of others. So please check the brochure for more on the profile. So here to speak on the topic, the good, the bad, and the ugly, the bright and dark sides of the human-animal bond. Please welcome Phil Arko.
Thank you, Dr. Sunday. Appreciate the opportunity to address this conference. Can you hear me okay? And can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Very good. Okay, excellent. Thank you, everybody. I am thrilled to see the turnout here in so many different countries represented. As Dr. Sunday mentioned, this is about the bright side and the dark side of the human-animal bond. I've been involved in animal protection work since 1973, but for about the last 40 years or so, I've been focusing primarily on these two areas, which is the good side and the bad side of the human-animal bond. Everybody on this Zoom call presumably understands what we're talking about with the human-animal bond and the benefits of animals and the therapeutic approaches for it. But there's a dark side to this as well. And this is where my work comes in. As my biography says, I wear two main hats here, although I do many other things. I head this group in the US, the National Link Coalition, which is the National Resource Center on the link between animal abuse and human violence. But I also teach animal-assisted therapy courses at Harcum College. I started doing animal therapy interventions back in 1973. And there's my contact information, by the way, and there's our website. I'll repeat that again later. And what I began to notice is that teaching the concept of compassion is a given for everybody on this call. But trying to sell legislators and trying to sell people who aren't in the animal affinity world is an enormous challenge. And the challenge for all of us is, how do we get the voting public and legislators on all levels to have enough compassion and empathy for animals to be able to enact and enforce good, strong animal protection laws? And as difficult as this is in developing nations like the US, or Canada or the UK or anywhere else in the Western world, I imagine it's particularly challenging in developing nations, such as most countries in Africa. So it's an enormous challenge. There are lots of problems with trying to get animal welfare laws enacted. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about companion animals, farm animals, or wild animals. The issues of the challenges are pretty much the same. Animals are chattel property. They have no legal standing. Standing is a legal term. That means they can't represent themselves in a court of law. They are considered property, and that is probably not going to change anytime in the foreseeable future. We now have a brand new skill that's out there, veterinary forensics. We've trained several hundred veterinarians around the world in using animal CSI, I like to call it, the crime scene investigation techniques, to be able to establish what happened to an animal in a cruelty situation. And that might be able to verify what kind of harm happened, but trying to prove the perpetrator's intent. And there aren't that many veterinary forensic specialists around, particularly in developing nations. So that makes getting a conviction extremely difficult. Prosecutors are elected officials, and they respond to public pressure. They also respond to financial contributions. And when the agriculture industries are funding political campaigns, you know that the moral issues of animal welfare are going to play, a lower priority than the financial contributions going into their coffers. Animals can't testify about what happened, so they can't tell us what the situation was. Witnesses are often afraid to testify because they are intimidated by the perpetrators of the violence. And frankly, most cases that come to the attention of animal protection authorities are unintentional neglect as opposed to deliberate outright cruelty, and prosecution may or may not be the best solution in that situation. Meanwhile, we have multiple philosophies that communities and groups have about animals. Kay Morgan devised this way back in 1986 in Community Animal Control magazine. And she identified 6 distinct philosophies that societies have, ranging on the most conservative side of animal exploitation. These are people who consider animals pure property, they're for our use. These are the animal fighters, and ranging to animal use, which are, the farmers and the hunters and people who say, yes, we can use animals, but we have to be responsible about it. Then we get an animal control and animal welfare and animal rights, which overlap in many areas, but they're quite different in some areas too. And finally, the extreme animal liberationists who say we shouldn't have any interactions with animals whatsoever. And you can see these groups have different philosophies, different approaches to breeding, animal euthanasia, enforcement of regulations, and how they work. If you go back and see the recording of this, you can read this in much more detail. On top of all that, we all have our individual attitudes about animals. Hal Herzog, American writer and researcher, recently wrote a tremendous book about the dichotomies that we have about animals. Some of them we love, some of them we hate, and some of them we eat, which makes it extremely hard to think straight about animals. Meanwhile, Stephen Keller came up with a typology of 10 distinct attitudes that Americans have towards animals. I suspect these would hold true in any country in the world. Some people prefer wildlife. They have a naturalist bent. The ecologists are more concerned with the environment. The humanists are people like James was talking about here earlier, people who are mostly attracted to pets. The animal rights activists tend to be more moralistically involved. The scientists, including veterinarians and researchers, appreciate animals for their scientific impact. There are people who appreciate animals for their aesthetic and artistic value. Farmers and ranchers are concerned with animal utilitarian interests. The animal fighters think they have total dominion over them. Some people are negative towards animals. Some people are just neutral about them. And the fact is, these situations can overlap. We can have multiple variations of these in our lives at any given time. They're affected by situations, and our attitudes change over time. And on top of all that, we have cultural variations. Based on ethnicity and community culture, religion, nationality, and many other factors. It gets so crazy with all this that there isn't even a uniform definition of what is an animal. And every jurisdiction in the world or any state in the United States has its own definitions. I was just at a conference in Portugal where the nation's top prosecutor was explaining how difficult it is to enforce animal welfare laws in Portugal because they can't decide whether or not ants or elephants are included in the animal statutes. I like this example here. If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck and looks like a duck, what is it? Well, of course it's a duck, but the fact is that duck could be somebody's pet animal. It could be a wild animal. It could be an agricultural food product, and the laws could treat that same duck completely differently, depending on what status it has. So another example of this is the old Indian folktale about the three blind men and the elephant. You know, they look at different parts of the elephant and they're trying to figure out exactly what it is. And an elephant is a great example. If that elephant is in a circus, legally it's considered somebody's private property. But if it's wandering the plains of or the savannas of Kenya, you know, it's this king's property, goes back to old common law, or the state's property, the nation's property. It's a wild animal. It's protected under those wildlife laws, but it could also be considered a nuisance to that farmer who's, you know, finding 200 pounds of his grain is being eaten every day by the marauding elephants. It's a peculiar form of property that can run away. And believe it or not, I have seen animal control situations in the US involving a stray elephant, where the animal control officer had to leash an elephant to the back of his truck. That elephant could be an endangered species and needs, you know, protection under a different set of laws. For the animal poachers, particularly in various nations in Africa, that elephant represents a source of income and is treated completely differently, and there are different laws affecting that. Some countries like Spain have said, yes, animals are property, but they're sentient property, and they're a special category of animals. We need to treat them accordingly. Some jurisdictions, we have several states in the US that say they're entitled to advocates in court to represent their interests in a cruelty case, like child protection advocates, because the animals can't speak up for themselves. Few jurisdictions, I think Spain is the most recent one, to say that, you know, this animal could be is defined as a member of the family. Then there are those who say the animals have rights. Given all of that, how is any legislator on a local level, a municipal level, a national level, how are they going to make sense about all this when we're trying to convince them that animals are important and they need protection for the many reasons that James just mentioned in terms of biodiversity and animal welfare and protecting human health and safety? I decided, and a number of others, many other people have done this as well, that we need to focus on the basic here, which is what got animal protection started with the James Hogarth drawings that William Hogarth drawings that James showed earlier back in the 1700s and the 1800s. It's not a question of morality. It's not a question of whether animals have rights, because we haven't reached consensus on that. The basic issue is that animal welfare helps people. That is a message that legislators can understand. And we can do this through a three-pronged approach. One is looking at the health benefits of animals and how animals can help people. And we can do that through animal-assisted therapy, through looking at how animals can help our mental and physical health, preventing dog bites and zoonoses, like James was mentioning, the neurochemistry of human-animal interactions, which James was describing, the One Health or One Welfare concept. I'll look at all of these in a little bit more detail here. Second is a relatively newer idea about social capital, about how animals can improve not only individual health and well-being, but also community health and well-being. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And then the third area is violence prevention, the link between animal abuse and human violence, which I'll go into more detail. By putting that all together, it's a three-pronged approach, because in the absence of a consensus about animals, how we feel about them, and their lack of legal standing, we can take a pragmatic course by emphasizing animal abuse's adverse impacts on human health and safety. And that's a message everybody can agree on. Let's look at some of these areas a little closer. Let's first of all look at the health benefits of animals, the bright side of the human-animal bond. Boris Levinson, who's widely considered to be the father of the modern animal-assisted intervention movement way back in the 1960s, when he brought his dog Jingles as a co-therapist with him in his child psychology practice. I love what he said. It's very simple. A pet is an island of sanity in what appears to be an insane world. And I think everybody on this call would certainly understand that concept. There's nothing like pet keeping anywhere in the whole world. Charles Schulz, the creator of our Peanuts cartoon, said it most eloquently, you know, in a cartoon such as this. And you look at the evolution of Snoopy over the years and people's interactions with Snoopy. The fact is, a smooch from your pooch can make your whole day brighter. And we have all experienced that feeling, come home from a hard day, whatever we do, and there's your dog, your cat, your hamster, your turtle, your guinea pig, whatever. And suddenly your oxytocin levels, change, and everything's right in the world for a little while. I started doing visits to nursing homes back in 1973. Actually, I remember a newspaper reporter interviewed me about it once, and I just love what she wrote. She said, it's not that nursing homes are going to the dogs are going to the nursing homes, and every indication is the residents love it. Happiness really is a warm puppy. And I think, again, everybody on this call, agrees with that general concept. Well, what explains that enormous attachment and affinity that so many people have towards animals? There are a lot of different theories. Let me just go into a couple of them. Some of them it's cross-cultural. I mean, we see that in every country in the world. Some of it's rooted in anthropology. James is among many researchers who've looked at tracing the history of the coevolution of humans and dogs in particular, but we can also look at horses and other species. And these interactions go back 15,000 years, 30,000 years. It's been argued that the domestication of animals changed humans from being hunter-gatherers to being settlers. We didn't have to follow the herds anymore. We could settle down in a particular area and let the animals do the work for us. It was a monumental change in human civilization. I think it's relevant that man's first aesthetic expression, man's first artwork on the walls of caves in what's now southern France were pictures of animals. We don't know what these pictures represent, but that bond between human and animals goes back, I think this was 32,000 years ago. Man's first buildings involve animals. This is the world's oldest physical structures. Okay, they were unearthed in Turkey a number of years ago. There are 20 temples. They're 11,500 years old. They have bas-reliefs of a wide variety of wild animals on them. Again, we don't know what the significance was. This is probably a temple, but to put this into perspective, these monoliths are 7,500 years older than the pyramids. And these temples, or these structures are older than agriculture, than pottery, than animal domestication and urban settlements. That's how archaic this affinity with animals is. Another possible explanation is the biophilia hypothesis. This is an idea that Erich Fromm first promoted back in the 1960s that said humans have a psychological orientation of being attractive to things that are alive and vital. E.O. Wilson developed this further in the 1980s. It said that humans have a subconscious and instinctive bond with other animals, and it's rooted in our evolutionary history because being aware of other animals helped us survive and let us know what the good things were that might not harm us, and the bad things that could harm us. Today, we extend that into what James was talking about, seeing pets in particular as ambassadors from nature. Richard Louv wrote a tremendous book about this 20 years ago now, and he updated it a little bit more recently, called Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder. And I'm always struck by the irony that Americans and Europeans will spend thousands of dollars or thousands of euros to take a photo safari in Kenya or Botswana or Tanzania, but they won't go out the back door and take a walk in the woods to see the natural wildlife that's in their own environment. We've all seen it with today's children. They're so busy immersed in their screens and their devices, they don't talk to each other anymore. Recent studies found that American kids spend 52 hours a week on their media and only 40 minutes outdoors. I was lecturing in Japan a number of years ago and went to the Tokyo Children's Museum and was struck by this little girl I saw playing this interactive video game. If you look over the screen there, you see the name of this thing is it's Nature Contact. When we have to go to a video screen to get contact with nature, that doesn't bode well for the future of the human species. And if you think things couldn't get any worse or any more ridiculous, you can now buy an iPotty. You can toilet train your toddler on this potty, okay, that has a built-in place for you to put your iPad, so your 18-month-old child can, get immersed in video games. I think it's absolutely, bizarre. James talked about the neurophysiology and the cortisol levels that change and the dopamine and endorphins that all go up and down depending on our interactions with animals. A lot of this is hardwired into our brains to help us, deal with the fight or flight syndrome. Japanese researchers have traced it to making eye contact. They call it the gaze. A lot of excellent research in this area here. Meanwhile, there are some underlying forces that are pretty powerful in affecting human-animal interactions. There's evidence that anthropomorphism plays a role in this. The more human-like qualities animals have, particularly round faces and walking upright, the more likely we are to identify with them and be attracted to them. There's neoteny, which is the preservation of juvenile qualities into adulthood. We can see that Stephen Jay Gould wrote about this, the evolutionary history of Mickey Mouse. Excuse me, I've got a lawnmower going on outside there. Mickey Mouse in the 1920s was this beady-eyed little, nasty looking rodent. And today he is, much more juvenile and much more appealing. I'm fascinated by the mystique of interspecies bonding. How many of us look like our pets? And I used to judge owner-pet look-alike contests. It's just a fascinating feeling there. There are many benefits, psychological benefits to pet companionship, and I don't have time to go into this whole list here, but I think we all understand how they can give us affection on demand that we don't get with human interactions. We see more people in the course of a day than our ancestors saw in the course of a lifetime. And every time we meet another person, it's a potential to raise our blood pressure. Animals, friendly animals, appropriate animals tend to lower our blood pressure, and they give us a sense of safety, and we can treat them as members of the family and so forth. Pets are a universal common denominator in the lives of children. And if you look at studies as to where pets are found, overwhelmingly it's in homes with kids. Gail Melson wrote this great book a number of years ago called Why the Wild Things Are: Animals in the Lives of Children. She did extensive research on children's literature and media, found they're saturated with animals. She found of the first 50 words children speak, once they get past mommy and daddy, it's doggy and ducky and kitty and horsey. She did a content analysis of fairy tales and found that fairy tales have more animals in them than fairies. And she found that for most American children, at least, overwhelmingly, their first experience of loss is through the death or disappearance of their pets rather than a human family member. Attachment is an enormously significant factor. James was talking about it as well. This is a model. I don't have time to go into this in detail, but you can see how many different characteristics impact how any of us might have a relationship or might not have a relationship with our animal companions. Animal therapy, of course, has developed. Animal-assisted therapy has developed as a result of all this. And some animals are extraordinary. I mean, we still don't really know how guide dogs and service dogs do the amazing work that we do. But we also have the ordinary, the average everyday companion animals. And I love this quote from a pet columnist. He wrote, "We've got dogs that can adapt to guiding the blind or sense an oncoming seizure or sniff out cancer, but we've got gazillions more that do the less specialized daily work of simply keeping their humans calm and on an even keel." This is nothing new, not even necessarily rocket science. Florence Nightingale, the eminent nurse and founder of so many nursing causes back in the 19th century, was predicting back then and emphasizing that a pet can be an excellent companion for the sick, especially for long-term chronic cases. Why do animal-assisted therapy and activities work? I love this quote. Judy Levikoff, colleague of mine, was running an animal therapy program in a local hospital. And she said, when the dogs go walking down the hall of the hospital, it's like that scene in The Wizard of Oz when everything changes from black and white to color. It's really as simple as that. You can hear the bubble of sound and enthusiasm as the animals go down the hall of the hospital. As James mentioned, the evidence on this is still pretty equivocal. There are both pros and cons. We don't completely understand it. Lots of possible reasons why pets might benefit human health. One theory says there is no causality, that people The factors which cause people to acquire and become attached to pets make them healthier to begin with. The theory is that pets enhance social interactions, and being interactive with other people wards off isolation and loneliness. And of course, the COVID lockdowns, had huge impacts on all of that. James Lynch wrote about this way back in the 1970s, I think it was. Pets provide emotional support, and that can be a major factor in human health benefits with animals. Second branch of this tree is pets impacting community health. It's called social capital. Social capital are the norms that hold a community together. This was a term that was popularized in 2000 by Robert Putnam, professor of public policy at Harvard, who wrote the 600-page book about why America was losing its connectivity, why it was losing its social capital, and how people just weren't being communitarian anymore. And in amazingly great detail, looking at all the factors in American society, not once did he mention the presence of animals in a community, and the fact that there are a lot of them and we have attachments to them and they affect people's lives and decision-making. A few years later, Lisa Wood at the University of Western Australia developed this concept that pets can improve social capital, community health. She found that pets give us a sense of community. They're catalysts for communications. It gives us something to talk to and through and about. Then, of course, during the COVID lockdowns, this became incredibly important, where just getting out and having to walk your dog, even if you were allowed to do even that, and meet your neighbors in the street was a way to get social connectivity. Lisa found that pets stimulate reciprocity between neighbors, and they build a sense of community trust. Takes more trust to ask your neighbor to look after your cat while you're on vacation than it does to just go next door and borrow a cup of sugar. She found pet owners use public spaces and recreational facilities more often, and they promote civic engagement. People with pets tend to vote more often. Another study found that over half of people are better at remembering the names of their neighbors' pets than they are of the names of the neighbors themselves. And I suspect most people on this call could identify with that. This social human-animal bond phenomenon is most potent during times of disaster, when people have to bond together anyway, and the animals are part of that as well. Hurricane Katrina in the United States was the most vivid example of this way back in 2005, but we've seen this time and time again in fires, floods, earthquakes, you name it, where people won't get off the rooftop and won't get onto the rescue helicopter unless they can take their pets with them. And one of the results of Hurricane Katrina was a federal program that now makes federal funding available for rescuing the animals as well as the people. It's a global phenomenon. I was lecturing in Japan several years after the Fukushima tsunami and nuclear meltdown there. And I mean, these are pretty dramatic pictures. One on the top there, we just can't imagine the devastation these people went through, but they took their pets with them. And I love the two pictures on the bottom. The one on the right is a woman getting her dog tested for radiation with a Geiger counter. On the left, it's an elderly woman in a refugee center feeding her dog grains of rice with chopsticks. This is the human-animal bond at its most powerful. But now we have the dark side of the human-animal bond, the link between animal abuse and human violence. And that link is shown very dramatically and very simply by this Venn diagram. It shows that animal cruelty, animal abuse, animal neglect is not a standalone as we've traditionally thought of it, because society says animals are less important than people. And so we have the animal protection over here and all the human services over here. The fact is they overlap. And we're often dealing with the same perpetrators, the same victims, the same root causes of family violence. And so animal abuse, domestic violence, elder abuse, and child maltreatment can overlap. And anybody working in any one of those four spheres can see other forms of family violence, and doesn't have to be an expert in it, but should be at least aware of it and know how to report it to the appropriate authorities in that community. And our motto for this is very simple. When animals are abused, people are at risk. And when people are abused, animals are at risk. It's really just as simple as that. We've identified 8 distinct types of links. It's most prevalent in the domestic violence arena, where the abuser, who's usually a man, tells the victim, who's usually a woman, and that's not always the case. We have women who abuse men. We've intimate partner violence and same-sex relationships as well, but it's generally a man abusing a woman. It exercises his power and control by using the animals as pawns and harming them or killing them or threatening and telling the other victims in the family they could be next. And if they leave, terrible things are going to happen to their animals. It's a form of emotional extortion. Consequently, there's no escape. There are many reasons why she doesn't leave, why she keeps coming back, but the fear of what will happen to her animals is an incredibly significant barrier. We find that in one study, as many as 97% of people calling the domestic violence hotline saying it's a factor in what they're going to do, and 50% of them won't leave unless there are provisions to care for their animals. We see a similar emotional extortion in child sexual abuse, where the abuser warns the little boy or girl that if they talk about what happened, he'll strangle her rabbit. And now this child is, forced to deal with emotional trauma, physical trauma, confusion, anxiety, physical pain, and now has to worry about her pet as well. There's a concept called adverse childhood experiences, which is a term that our American Centers for Disease Control use to describe early childhood traumas and how they lead to not only lifelong emotional trauma, but also people taking greater physical health risks, which leads to earlier mortality and worse regular health as well. The impact of children committing or witnessing animal cruelty was not included in among the adverse childhood experiences, which is a tremendous gap in the system. What we do know is that a child committing an act of animal cruelty is one of the earliest signs of conduct disorder, and it starts showing up at about the age of 6.5. We have the issue of bullying, and it's not just youths who bully other youths who are more aggressive towards animals as we'd expect, but youths who have been bullied take out that anger that's been directed at them and redirect it against animals, and they're more likely to be animal abusers. We have the animal hoarders. Can affect any age group, but it tends to be more elderly people, usually women, usually socially isolated, and so it's often linked with elder abuse and other issues affecting senior populations. We have dog fighting and cockfighting, which are linked with racketeering, homicides, sex trafficking, narcotics, weapons offenses, gambling, and many other community crimes. The mass shooters, the school shooters, current evidence suggests about 10% of them have histories of animal cruelty. That's a very significant risk factor. And then animal sexual abuse. There are people who prefer to have sex with animals. They try to justify it as a legitimate sexual preference. Is now illegal in 49 of our 50 states. And the reason for this becoming illegal more recently than it always has been is because we're linking it with child pornography and child sexual abuse and internet sex crimes. And whenever we have a case of animal sex abuse, we almost always seem to find these sex crimes against people. So animal abuse is the tip of the iceberg. And whoever investigates animal abuse in a community, if they look for it, can often find other forms of family violence, lying hidden beneath the surface. And it occurs across the lifespan. The animal abuse may precede these other crimes and may follow it, or they may co-occur with it. And vulnerable children, women, and elders are all at risk. If we recognize animal abuse as an indicator that something's wrong in a household, that may be the first step in stopping the cycles of violence. I'll talk briefly about some of the different dimensions of this. How does animal abuse interface with child abuse? This is the oldest area of the link. It goes back to philosophers hundreds of years saying abusive children grow up to become violent adults. James mentioned Randy Lockwood here earlier today. This is another study that Randy did looking at children who are under investigation for, or families of children being investigated for possible child abuse. 60% of these families also had abused or neglected pets. And where there was physical child abuse in that household, the rate of animal abuse was 88%. That's an enormous risk factor there. Two other things came out of the study. There were 11 times more dog bites in these homes where there was animal abuse and child abuse. So now the children are being subjected not only to the emotional trauma of animal abuse, but also the physical trauma, the threat of rabies, of dog bites. And also, they found that these families tended to see veterinarians at pretty much the same rate as non-abusive households. So we're training veterinarians now worldwide to recognize that, yes, you will see abused animals and you will see abused children and you will see domestic violence issues among your clients, and you need to be prepared to respond to that. In the domestic violence arena, like I said, this is probably the most prevalent area of the link. Pets are overwhelmingly found in homes with children. The woman's the primary caregiver, so the veterinarian is primed to see, mom with a couple of kids in tow, bringing the animals into the veterinarian for regular care. The emotional attachment that women and children tend to have towards their animals make those pets soft targets. And the abuser will harm or threaten or kill them to establish his power and control. He's holding the family hostage. He uses it to get revenge against her or family members or friends who help her escape. A study in New Zealand found they deliberately target the animals and they brag about it because they don't realize they're confessing to a crime. They brag about it because they can harm the animals. They're convenient. They're these soft targets. They think the cops don't care. And frankly, they do it because it works. It's an extremely effective coercion control technique. Like I said, 97% of women say they won't leave. The pets are important in making a decision as to whether they'll leave an abusive situation. Half of them won't leave. 48% said they're afraid of what will happen to the animals. But this also is the intergenerational cycle of violence. 30% of them say their children are aware of this abuse. And 72%, almost 3/4 of these women, don't realize that we now have pet-friendly women's shelters in the US, and we're starting to see more and more of these in other countries around the world. In the elder abuse arena, people working with senior citizens are often dealing with some stereotypical situations. Patients or clients with memory loss, Alzheimer's and dementia issues, people who are on fixed or low income so they can't afford pet care or veterinary care. They have their own health problems. They're socially isolated. They don't have transportation. They're physically weak. And these conspire to create a number of issues that affect their animals as well. We have situations where seniors love their pets. They're deeply attached to them, but because of those limitations, the animals are neglected. We have the flip side of that. We have self-neglect. They'll take what little money they have and spend it on their pets' welfare instead of themselves. And so they're starving, but the pets are happy and healthy. Or they won't go into a hospital or long-term care because there's nobody to take care of their animals. The attachment that a senior citizen has towards this animal can be extremely intense. This animal may be the last link to a spouse who passed away. It may be the only reason she has to get up in the morning and have a sense of purpose of what she has to do to care for the animal. And when that animal passes away, the loss can be devastating. It could be the only reason she has to live. We're training veterinarians to recognize that if somebody brings all their animals in and wants to have them euthanized, to call the suicide prevention hotline, because that's a surefire sign that they are trying to clean up all their affairs. We have caseworkers in the adult protective services area who don't go into a home where there are too many animals because they are either overrun with rats and vermin because the owner has neglected the animals. She hasn't changed the litter box in weeks, or the dog food tins have piled up in the sink, or she's just afraid of the animals. And so, the person's being denied services. We have coercion and control in elder abuse, like we do in domestic violence and child sexual abuse. We've had cases of parents, of adults holding their elderly parents' pets hostage for ransom money as a way to extort money out of them by threatening their pets. In the case of disabled persons, one partner might be jealous of the disabled partner's dependence on their service animal and becomes a significant issue. And then the animal hoarding situation, which again can be any age group, but it tends to be more elderly people. So how are we in the US and a growing number of countries around the world responding to this? Well, the National Link Coalition was founded in 2008 and now has over 5,100 people in 55 countries around the world who read our free monthly link letter. And I would encourage all of you on this call, if you're interested, send me an email or go to our website and just ask to subscribe to the link letter. You won't be hit with spam. We're not going to solicit you for anything. Just let us know in your signature where you're coming from and if you're with a particular organization. We're a nonprofit or an NGO, and we emphasize community partnerships because the problems affecting any one of these 4 fields of family violence are too great for any one agency or department to solve on its own. But by working together, we can deal with the limited resources and pool those resources to create safer communities. We work in 4 major areas. We showcase tremendous programs going on around the world. We monitor legislation on all levels. We build public and professional awareness through training programs such as this. And we report on academic research about the link. We have over 2,100 citations in our bibliography right now. And we establish local and national coalitions. We now have great coalitions going in Canada, the UK, Spain, Italy, and Sweden, among other countries. So again, feel free to join our ranks. There's no charge for this. The link helps resolve these legislative challenges in protecting animals and people. Because there is no public consensus about the role of animals in society, because they have no legal standing, the most pragmatic course is to emphasize how animal abuse impacts human health and human safety, and that animal abuse is a possible predictor or indicator of other crimes. And I emphasize possible. It doesn't mean that every little kid who kicks the cat is going to become a serial killer, but without appropriate intervention, he might. This is something we can all agree on. The link provides a path forward to prevent future violence, and emphasizing the link gets law enforcement, prosecutors, and courts to take animal abuse much more seriously. Criminal justice and law enforcement officials who understand the link between crimes against animals and crimes against people, and who do a better job of preventing, prosecuting, and punishing animal cruelty offenders, are in a better position to prevent future violence and protect their community. The former mayor of Baltimore in the United States said it great a number of years ago in setting up an animal cruelty task force in her city. She said, animal cruelty is more than just a legal issue. It's a community issue. If you improve animal welfare in a community, you improve public safety for everyone. And again, that's a message that legislators can understand and appreciate. We can protect people and animals better through partnerships and recognizing the link. By recognizing that animal cruelty is a crime of violence and it's not just the animal that is victimized. We can recognize animal abuse, like I said, it's a potential indicator and predictor crime. If we hold animal abusers accountable, it prevents other crimes and changes a community's attitude towards violence and safety. And measures to prevent, to prosecute, and punish animal cruelty certainly benefit man's best friend, but they also benefit man, and they really benefit woman. We've seen tremendous legislative progress in the US in recent years as a result of this emphasis. People in other countries don't understand the American system here. We don't have very many national laws that affect this. We have 50 individual states, and each state has its own law. And so everything is pretty much done on the state level rather than on the federal level. But as a result of focusing on the link, now all 50 states and the federal government, for that matter, have some form of animal cruelty considered a felony as opposed to a minor offense. And we now have 49 states that ban sex with animals, and that's been a major step forward. We still have one state to go. In 42 states, veterinarians are either required or permitted to report suspected animal abuse. This has been a long battle trying to get veterinarians to recognize they need to be as proactive in responding to animal cruelty as pediatricians are in responding to child abuse. We now have 39 states that allow courts to include pets in protection from abuse orders in domestic violence situations. And we now have over 300 pet-friendly domestic violence shelters or refuges, which make it easier for women with pets to escape and take the pets with them and keep the entire family together and keep those human animal bonds intact. In 22 of our 50 states, animal sex abusers have to go on the registry as a sex offender. We have a patchwork of states that allow child protection officials, animal protection officials, and adult protective service officials to cross-report to each other. In 12 of our 50 states, an act of animal abuse is defined as an act of domestic violence in these coercive control situations. In a number of states, dogfighting is can be prosecuted as a criminal enterprise. And one of the newest developments we have, because so many domestic violence situations end up in divorce, and because one party will bring the animal into an animal shelter to put it up for adoption or have it even euthanized so the other party doesn't get it in the divorce, we're now seeing 8 states that allow courts to award custody of pets in a divorce case to the party determined to be in the animal's best interest, similar to a child custody case. Focusing on the link, and law enforcement sends a powerful message to the community and the voters. It gets positive votes for public officials. It inspires law enforcement and the courts to treat animal welfare cases more seriously. Bottom line, it prevents future violence and creates safer communities. We're doing it slowly but surely in the US. Africa can do it too. By focusing on how children, animals, women, and elders all have these common influences, these common forms of family violence. By working together, we can do a much better job in protecting everybody. Let me finish with a great quote from Jennifer Wolf. She's a forensic veterinarian here in the US. She says, "The canary in the coal mine of an abusive home may literally be an abused canary. By responding to the injury or death of that canary, we can potentially save many other pets and people." So again, thank you. I think we may or may not have a couple minutes here for questions. Sunday, if you want to go through any questions, I'll be pleased to take them. Or if we don't have time, feel free to email me your questions offline and I will be pleased to answer them. And again, if you'd like to get on our link letter mailing list, just send me an email or do the contact page on our website. Love to talk to you. And we have all kinds of great resources on the website about the link. So thank you, Sunday.
So thank you so much. Someone was asking just now about how they could mail you. So that's his mail. This is your mail now, right? Your active
That's my
mail.
email address. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, so this is his active email on the slide right now, Shari. So you can just get the mail from here. And so yes, we are behind time, but I'll probably just run through 2 quick questions from the pre-conference questions. I'll just mention both questions together and then please just give some context to them. So the first question, it's rather long, so the person says, and this is Ruth from Kenya. So Ruth says, I've lived in the rural community for more than 20 years till I moved to the city for university. My community is mostly indigenous clans who value policing animals and nature. Fast forward to now, at 34 years old, I'm overwhelmed at the rate of urbanization in my village, where most people are migratory. Okay, I was trying to look for the question part of it. Anyway, and pollution, poaching, and all of that is reported on a daily basis. Animal cruelty, pollution, and everything. So she's saying, apart from creating awareness, what else can I use to make the community see the importance of co-living with animals as an added advantage? That's the first question. Let me just
okay.
So the second question, the person asks, so this is Juliet from Kenya. So Juliet asks, how can we change culture, in bracket retrogressive, or cultures that are a threat to animal welfare in regards to human-animal interactions?
Tough challenges, absolutely. And as I said at the beginning, particularly in developing nations, it is an even more enormous challenge. When we have disposable resources, or more likely have disposable resources, such as in the Western world, it's easier when people have had pets as children, as James was pointing out, and can build up an attachment and affinity for animals. It's easier to get these concepts across. I mentioned Stephen Keller's typology there of the 10 attitudes towards animals. What he found was that where people grow up as children is one of the biggest determinants. And people who live in rural areas, whether it's a farm in the Midwest of the US or a small village in Kenya, where animals cohabit the village as opposed to, or are commercial properties, or are sources of income, people don't have that same affinity towards animals, the same empathy towards animals as do urban dwellers. I like that, she mentioned that she moved to the city, and people who are in city areas tend to have animals as pets as opposed to rural areas where they're more likely to see wildlife or farm animals. It's an enormous cultural gap, and we see that in every country in the world. Trying to change that culture is an extremely difficult challenge. For example, if we can find other sources of revenue for the people who are poaching wildlife and give them something else to do besides the wildlife poaching that can make them more money, by cutting down on the illegal ivory trade, for example, and give them alternatives to that, that might be a way to change that culture. It's also an educational process, but I have to tell you, after many, many, many years in this field, every single conference I've gone to has always ended saying, we need more humane education. We need more, teach children about being empathy and kind towards animals. The fact is, none of the educational efforts we've done since the 1860s has been evaluated to prove whether they work or not. It's a lifelong process. And it often, as James was mentioning, and as I was mentioning, it depends often on how we react to pets, companion animals in our childhood and develop empathy for them, and it's parental values that get handed down. I wish I could give that person who asked that question there a nice simple answer. There isn't one, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you so much. In truth, like Fiona Bergen once said, somewhere that I saw, she said, the basic care of animals should be taught in schools. I totally agree with that as well. Okay, so at this point, we would be moving to the next speaker for the conference today. So please, the next speaker is a professor in the Department of Counseling and Higher Education at the University of North Texas, which is located in Texas, where she has taught various graduate courses in counseling since 1989. For over 30 years, she's been a licensed professional counselor and supervisor, and a licensed marriage counselor as well. So licensed marriage therapist. And she has been involved with animal-assisted psychotherapy, supervision, and research since 1999. She's the author of the classic book, Animal-Assisted Therapy in Counseling. The third edition was published in 2017. She's also the author of the book, Animal-Assisted Interventions for Emotional and Mental Health, Conversations with Pioneers of the Field, published in 2018. For her work in animal-assisted therapy, she received in 2016 the American Counseling Association's Professional Development Award, and in 2009, the Thelma Duffy Award for Vision and Innovation from the Association for Creativity in Counseling. Here to present on the topic, mental health benefits from positive human-animal interaction, please make welcome Professor Cynthia Chandler.
Good morning, everyone.
Good afternoon, our time.
Can you see the slideshow?
Yes, perfectly.
All right, took me a minute there to pull it up. I always appreciate what Phil Arco has to say. I've been able to stay familiar with his work, and that was a great presentation. We're changing gears quite a bit here with me. I'm a psychotherapist. I train other psychotherapists, and one of my specialty areas is animal-assisted therapy. So I train people to work with their pet partners, domesticated animals, to provide mental health counseling services. And been doing that for several years. I've also practiced it and researched it myself. So Sunday asked me to talk about the mental health benefits from positive human-animal interaction and how we incorporate those into our professional practice of psychotherapy. So we rely on the fact that domesticated mammals and humans, who are also mammals, we share a lot of the same neurobiology. And this explains how animals and human-animal interaction can be so useful in mental health services. So the mammal brain for humans and other domesticated mammals, animals such as dogs, cats, horses, we have to understand how the thrive and survive systems are involved in psychotherapy, and also other forms of therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, and so forth. How this explains the relationship that can be so healing. The second thing involved in that process is mirror neurons. So we'll be taking a look at both of those, how humans and therapy animals affect one another's responses. The third thing that we'll address is the superior olfactory system of therapy animals and how this contributes to the therapy process. And the final thing that we'll explore is electromagnetic energy, how therapy animals may sense positive and negative energy from another being. Humans can do this too, but to a much inferior level. And all my sources and references for my presentation are listed at the end. So for those of you who are not familiar with this, we'll take a look at the thrive and survive systems of the mammal brain and how they might be involved in the therapy process. So the part of the brain of humans and other animals that are mammals for need, threat alerting is our survive system. And it's located in the brain closely to the reward section of the brain, which is our thrive system. And so these two systems are separate, but they're very interconnected and interactive. This has been studied quite a bit from a number of researchers and veterinarians around the world. So our survive system is our fight, flight, freeze actions, right? So that's another name for that is our stress response system. And our thrive system, which is our reward and gratification system, is also known as our social response system. So it's the stress response and social response systems that we cue into in a very sensitive way and pay attention to, and we utilize in the human-animal interactions and understanding what that might reveal for us about the client, as well as how it might help the client in terms of their healing and progress in therapy. Okay, so all mammals are wired to nurture themselves and others through social interaction, again, part of the thrive system, and they commonly seek out social interaction for nurturance, and also as a way of reducing stress in self or others. So the fact that dogs and cats and horses who are domesticated and well socialized want to interact with humans, that's a real plus in how they can nurture humans in a session. That's a real plus in psychotherapy. But mammals, humans, dogs, cats, horses are neurologically wired to detect and respond to stress also. And they'll do this by either moving away from the stressor to make themselves more comfortable, or they may move towards the stressed being in order to alleviate or nurture it. So they don't necessarily move away from all stress unless it's too intense. First, they might try to reduce the stress in the other person by approaching the person and trying to reduce the stress in that person. They do this with each other. Dogs do it with each other. Horses do it with each other, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes an animal human or an animal who's a mammal might not be able to do this if they've had some sort of trauma or difficulty in childhood. So the endocrine, there's a lot of endocrine involvement in the relational process. The activation of the stress response is going to increase the number of hormones associated with stress, the production of cortisol, adrenaline, aldosterone, and the activation of the social response system or the Thrive system. You're going to have an increase in the hormones associated with oxytocin, endorphins, and dopamine, which are wellness hormones. And while it's increasing the wellness hormones, also when the social response system is activated, it's decreasing the stress hormones. So this is how human-animal interaction, again, plays a part in the psychotherapy process. Of course, endorphins lift mood. Dopamine stimulates the reward system in the brain. And oxytocin or oxytocin enhances social connection and also lowers blood pressure, normalizes heart rate, lowers anxiety and distress. And nurturing touch increases this production greatly. Of course, the skin is the largest organ we have in the body. And so when there's nurturing touch, there's even a greater amount of production of these hormones. In psychotherapy, we usually don't touch our clients. There can be an exception for children if they want to get a hug or give a hug. But there's not a lot of touching that goes on in psychotherapy because we want to make sure that the client feels safe and not exploited by their psychotherapist. So one of the nice things about having an animal in therapy also is because they are a surrogate for what can be a very therapeutic touch, the petting and the hugging and so forth. So the social interaction can generalize to other animals of the same species. We rely on all these natural tendencies like horses in a herd, interaction of dogs in a pack. These are not things that, so that what we're talking about today are not things that we train our animals to do in a therapy session. These are all natural tendencies of the animals. So that's what I want to emphasize, is that we are not asking the animals to do anything other than what they not normally or naturally do. We do train them to be good citizens so that they can interact with humans and are comfortable interacting with humans, and that's for the benefit and welfare of the animal as well as for the human. So again, a little review. During human-animal interaction, both humans and animals that are mammals can facilitate relational moments that will either activate the social response system or activate or respond to the stress response system. And when there's positive social interaction, in all mammals, dopamine rises, stimulating the reward system in the brain, endorphins rise, enhancing mood, oxytocin rises, which has all kinds of wellness and healing benefits. One, of course, makes the most powerful is in enhancing or increasing a sense of social connection, sense of safety, a lowering of anxiety, feeling more comfortable in the moment. And of course, then with the stress response system, when that's activated, adrenaline rises, these are stress hormones, cortisol rises, aldosterone rises, but they will decrease when the social response system is activated. So this is what you want to keep in mind as a psychotherapist, or understanding how animal-assisted therapy is helpful in psychotherapy and other therapies like occupational therapy and speech therapy and so forth, where animals participate in sessions. So the activation and interaction of the stress response system and the social response system can generalize across various species. Petting and soothing touch increases the social response hormones and decreases stress response hormones for the one being petted as well as the one who is petting. So we do not ask animals to participate in a session if they do not want to. That's key in psychotherapy, not only modeling wellness and nurturing relations for the client, but also it's good for the animal. The animals are always given a choice as to whether they want to interact with the client or the therapist. And so we design our therapy situation, whether it's inside a room or outside in an arena, if we're working with horses. We always make sure the animal has a choice to come and go in the therapy process. We never force or coerce the animals to participate. It's all a willingness to do so on their part. Their choice to do so is helpful in terms of the nurturing and the opportunity for the client to interact with the animal, but also the animal's choice not to participate or interact with the human is also quite revealing and can bring up a lot of repressed or suppressed issues for a client. And it also sends some messages to the therapist as to, hey, there's really some stuff going on with the client. It's so intense that the animal doesn't even want to be a part of it. So that's helpful information for us. So in a therapy session, primary is to have a good relationship with your human client. So a client is going to feel very emotionally vulnerable, very emotionally exposed in a psychotherapy session. So the key is to build a trusting relationship with that client so that they feel safer, more comfortable, revealing things to us. And it's only if they can reveal these things to us that we can be helpful to help them uncover insights and awareness and ideas for healing and recovery and dealing with trauma and family relation issues and so forth. Anytime a therapy animal and a client are in the same perceptual field, there's going to be relational moments occurring. Even a client standing in a fence, looking across a pasture at a horse in a distance, that's having an impact on the client. If the horse sees that client, it's having an impact on the horse. So anytime the animal and the human client are in the same perceptual field or enter the same therapy atmosphere, there are what I call a series of relational moments going on. And those are important to pay attention to, but they're constant and continuous. So as psychotherapists, we try to sort out which one of those human-animal relational moments might be significant enough to tell us something important, reveal something about that client that we might want to share with the client, or point it out to a client. And so I call those CHARMs simply because that's the acronym. So this acronym is very helpful in training to help my students understand how to parse out, how to pick out from this whole continuous series of relational moments that might be occurring, those that might be of therapeutic significance, and how to utilize those significant moments in understanding our client better and also helping the client understand themselves better. So a bit of an oversimplification, but it's still helpful in understanding how animal-assisted psychotherapy works, is that I see that there are two primary roles for animals in human-animal interaction in a psychotherapy setting. One is animal as nurturer, and the second is animal as emotional distress detector, because animals are very good at detecting what's going on inside of a human, and we will discuss ways that they can do that. So human or animal behaviors during an interaction can signal either nurturing moments or challenging moments for a client, and each of which can be beneficial or therapeutic for the client, depending on the animal handler's effective facilitation within their defined role. So first and foremost, to do animal-assisted therapy, you must be a professionally trained therapist. In my case, a licensed counselor or family therapist. These are both considered psychotherapists. So I have to be really good at being a psychotherapist. Or if I work with animals and provide occupational therapy, which is not my field, or if I provide the opportunity to interact with animals in speech therapy or physical therapy, which are also not my fields, I have to be trained in those fields. And in the United States, we actually not only have to be trained and have an advanced degree, but we have a process called licensing. It's an imperative that you be very, very familiar with the animal's behavior that you're working with, so that you can understand what they might be picking up on, signaling with their behavior. Animals are constantly communicating. And if we can understand better what they're communicating and how they're communicating it, the better we are at interpreting those behaviors, the better use we can get out of the human-animal interaction. So spend time, even if it's not your pet or your animal. I work mostly with dogs and cat. I've worked a lot with horses. I've never had my own horses, so I rely on somebody else's horses, but I make sure I spend time with those horses and understand those particular horse's individual quirks, personalities, behavior tendencies, so that I'll be better at interpreting that animal's behavior. When I started working with my therapy dog, Rusty, back in 1999, I pretty much did not know what I was doing. I was a really good counselor, really good psychotherapist, but I'd never done animal-assisted therapy before. And so I got interested in it, and there wasn't a lot of training going on. The most training that I could get at the time was how to be a volunteer, like visiting with my pet at a hospital, which I did. Visiting with my pet for recreational purposes at a juvenile detention center. But because I was also a psychotherapist, I was invited to actually have my pets attend my psychotherapy sessions with the juveniles, the adolescents at a detention center. And I was very interested in this new rising field of animal-assisted psychotherapy. So I paid attention to what was going on, and I started to see very different types of dynamics occurring when the animals were present. And so it was through the process of doing and practicing that I was able to learn how each individual pet, and I only worked with one pet at a time to make sure I could handle understanding all the various dynamics that were being presented in a session and keep everybody safe. And it was really, I tell people this, and it's the absolute truth, is paying attention to what my Rusty dog, my first pet that I involved in animal-assisted therapy, paying attention to what he was doing and the effect it was having on the client, and then having these interactive discussions with the client, like what's going on. I learned all about animal-assisted therapy. And of course, that was my first step in really valuing and learning to appreciate the immense amount of communication that an animal is presenting in a session, what they're detecting, what they're trying to tell me. And dogs do this naturally because this is how they communicate with one another. Horses do this. This is how they communicate with one another, and how they thrive as animals, even though horses are prey animals and dogs are typically predator animals. They still have these family systems wired into their brain, which work very similarly to humans. And they don't like a situation where there's intensity. So they're either going to move away from it, but if they're well socialized and well domesticated, typically what they'll first try to do is approach the thing that they're sensing is stressed out or anxious and try to calm them down. You know, we don't want the dogs and all the pack to be nervous. Let's calm everybody down. So they do the same thing to all the humans in the room. Let's calm everybody down. We don't need all this intensity. And if it's too much, they're like, okay, I'm going to go over here in the corner and get away from all this stress. Or I'm just going to sleep here on the floor and get away from all this stress. So animals are great as nurturers and emotional distress detectors. And so in psychotherapy involving human-animal interaction, the key is to value what the animal is telling you. Never discount it, never devalue it. Pay attention. Now, you're not going to be able to see and understand everything the animal's trying to communicate, but the more you practice it, the better you get at it. And even if you miss it the first 1 or 2 times, the animal has a tendency to keep signaling what's going on so that you eventually figure it out. And I'll get into that in a little bit more depth. So you really need to be familiar with what the animal might be telling you. Some of these behaviors are typical for the species and the breed, but some of them are unique to the own individual unique personality of the animal. Here's my cat Snowflake. He lived for 20 years. He participated in animal-assisted therapy at the juvenile detention center with me for 3 years until he decided it was time for him to retire. That's part of honoring the animal. He was really interested in interacting with the kids there, playing with them with little toys and laying in their laps, until one day he just wouldn't sit in anybody's lap except mine. And sorry, I just had the alarm go off. I'll deal with that. So when he was no longer interested in participating, I gave him a chance to say goodbye and the kids to say goodbye to him, and retired him and was able to process all kinds of issues about not being able to visit with him anymore with the kids. And so they learned to say goodbye and process some grief issues there. And he was happy at my home watching the birds through the window for the next decades of his life. So he just passed away last year. So he was a great nurturer. Here's an example of how animals can be great emotional distress detectors. Of course, dogs can do these various behaviors too, but I love this photograph that I borrowed from someone because it shows you the 3 different levels of emotional distress detection. And so if you'll pay attention to this photograph, you'll see that the horse in the forefront, not too happy. So he's decided this is too intense. I'm running away from the situation. He's most threatened by the person that he's closest to, which is sort of running towards him. And horses do not like you to run towards them. You know, they're prey animals. They need you to be calm. If you're not exhibiting a sense of calmness or confidence, they're going to move away from you. When we have the horse, this brown horse a little further back, the second brown horse, and he's sort of in that no horse land. He's like, hasn't decided exactly yet how to react to the situation. His ears are forward. He's very aware that the horse in front is running. He's thinking, maybe I should run too. But he's sizing up the situation. The people closest to him they're standing there still calm, so they're not very threatening. The horse behind him and the person behind him, they don't seem to be very threatening. It's just the situation in front that seems a little bit threatening. So he might decide to, act on the side of caution and bolt like the horse in front, or he may just decide to hang with the horse in the back and stay calm until he senses that there might be more stress going on. Then we have the brown and white horse in the background. This brown and white horse is closest to a person who's walking calmly by the horse's side. He doesn't seem to be decided to be threatened by the situation yet. He's like, I'm okay with all this, so I'm just going to stay here and stay calm. I'll pay attention to what's going on, but I'm calm. So I've got 3 different levels of stress detection and the reflection of that. One horse who's moving away from stress, one horse is sort of hanging in there just to decide what to do, and another horse which is like, I'm okay, I'm just going to stay right here. Here's an example of being able to observe a situation between humans and animals and see how the animals might be being affected and what they might be revealing about the situation. Now, it's really important too that you don't just have these things occur. We would process this with the humans after the end of the session. What did you see in the session? What did you observe? What did you learn about yourself? What did you learn about the horses? How did you feel when the horses responded that way? What kind of adjustments do you think you need to make in your attitude and behavior in order to have a horse be calm and want to be with you? How does this relate to other aspects of your life, to generalize it to maybe their family members, friends, so forth, that they might be having relationship difficulties? It teaches them about emotional recognition, emotional regulation. There are many, 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 many things that can possibly come out of this situation that can be very beneficial in a psychotherapy session. So one of the ways, again, that you want to make the best use of human-animal interaction is understand what animals might be doing that will be signaling stress. There are 3 primary categories of for understanding how animals might naturally signal perception of stress. Again, these are natural tendencies of the animals. They do not need to be trained to do this. An animal who is not well socialized, which are animals who typically won't participate in psychotherapy, are going to probably exhibit a lot more of these. But animals who are very well socialized and very friendly and very familiar with humans will still signal some of these naturally. So the first category is displacement signals. So animals will actually change their posture or body position if they're sensing something needs to be attended to or something is stressful. So the dog may suddenly sit up or walk over to a client or walk away. A horse may back away. Again, as we mentioned before, sometimes an animal will actually move towards and engage a client to try to nurture and calm down the client. Another category is called calming signals. And for dogs, this may look like rapid eye blinking, yawning, looking away and looking back, some quick lip licking. For horses, this might be blinking, empty chewing, turning away. There's a whole list of calming signals for various animals that are mammals, rabbits, birds, cats, etc. And the third category is alerting signals. When the animal either may vocalize or show in their body language something that needs to be attended to. Like walking over to a client, barking, ears forward for a horse, looking at a client. You know how my dog is telling me it's time to eat, and I have gotten too involved in my computer and I'm not paying attention. She will walk over to the dog bowl, sit next to it, and stare at me. So she's used displacement signals and alerting signals to let me know it's time to eat. And then the category of mirror neurons, mammals can mirror the behavior within species and cross-species companions. The brain mechanism in humans and other mammals to recognize and reflexively mimic a behavior, including emotional expressions. This is highly developed in all mammals. So if a dog sees a client smile, it's going to wag its tail relaxed in a friendly way. When a client sees a dog relaxing its tail in a friendly way, they're going to smile more. When dogs smile, humans smile. So both for stress response reactions and social response reactions, this mimicking of behavior is unconscious. It happens naturally in humans and animals that are mammals. So this is constantly taking place, reading each other's body expressions and being affected by them. And then the olfactory system. So humans don't smell very well compared to other animals that are mammals. These noses are designed to smell, horses, dogs, cats, etc. And to hold on to the smell, to not habituate to the smell so the smell continues. And so these animals actually rely on their sense of smell, not only to find food or to detect threats, but also to socially get a read on emotions and attitudes of each other and on humans. So non-human animal noses, like the ones we see here, they're actually engineered for smell perception. They have flared nostrils, long receptor areas, large area of the brain is dedicated to detection and processing smell. So they have hundreds and hundreds of millions of olfactory receptors, as well as the basic design. So smell is one of the ways that they detect what's going on in a situation, including understand the humans that they interact with. So humans can benefit from what an animal might be telling us about what they're smelling. So they're going to smell something and they're going to use displacement signals, calming signals, alerting signals to tell us, hey, what are they smelling? It's very, very helpful if you pay attention to the body language that's an animal reflects when they're maybe sniffing what's going on. And again, they can smell whether you can actively tell what they're sniffing. But if they need to get a closer sniff, like a dog will walk over and sniff the hands or breath of a client to get a closer read on what's going on. The veterinarian research has showed us that dogs typically sniff human breath and human hands for emotional detection. And they'll sniff the urinary process to see if they can detect illnesses or whether somebody is in heat and so forth, but identification also. But the breath in the hands is usually reserved mostly for emotional detection. So the animals can smell emotions in humans, and how they respond to that is going, and your familiarity with that animal's behavior is going to tell you a lot about what's going on with that client. And I can say things like, hey, you know what? Jesse just went over there and sniffed your breath and then cuddled with you in your lap. What do you think she's picking up on there? And then a client, even if that client has been sort of hesitant to reveal anything, they believe the animal, right? They're a lot more trusting of the animal than they are the human. Unless, of course, the client is afraid of animals, which means they might not be an ideal candidate for animal-assisted psychotherapy. But they're like, oh, yeah, she's come over here because she knows I'm afraid. You know, I'm afraid of talking about what I think I really need to talk about in therapy. And so they trust the animal. They know the animal's not lying. They know the animal's only going to be completely honest and only reflect what's happening in the moment. And so in trusting that, they're like, yeah, the animal's picking up on this. So clients become a lot more self-revealing, a lot more emotional memory and experiences are recalled and also shared more easily in the therapy session when the animals are responding and interacting with the human client. And we psychotherapists rely on that. We really, really rely on that more than anything. And that is the humans talking to us, regardless of age. The clients, it's called talk therapy. It's called process therapy. The clients talk, we process that together and turn it into something different. You know, it's like all the words they share with us are like bananas and apples and protein powder that we throw into the blender and we mix it all up with our food processor and it becomes something different, a wonderful smoothie. So with the words and the sharing, both the verbal and nonverbals that the client shares with us in a session through the talk therapy, we process that together with the client and it turn it into something more meaningful and useful for the client. And so by having the human interact with the animal and the animal interact with the human, a lot more vegetables and fruits through word salad come to the surface and gives us more, gives us psychotherapists and our clients more to work with. The more we have to work with, the more impactful the therapy, the quicker the healing, the greater the depth of the healing. So that's how animals assist us just through their natural interactions. I like to throw this in just because it's another example of the kind of behavior you want to pay attention to. Although there's many, the horse's Flehmen response, this enhances their sense of smell. When you see a horse do this, basically what they're trying to do is capture the olfactory molecules in their nose and hold it there for a little bit greater sensation of what's going on. Cats do this too, but they do it through their mouth because the organ that detects the smell is in the upper roof of the mouth of cats and dogs, whereas it's in the nostrils of the horse. So cats will do this through breathing through their mouth. Dogs can also receive additional olfactory information through their mouths through what is called the Jacobson organ. So animals are positively nosy, and non-human mammals will better detect many emotions through smelling body secretions for most often the breath of other animals, and additionally from the human's sweat and their breath on their hands. And they will respond to the emotions that they detect. And as I said before, animals will usually smell the urine and genital area for breeding, identification, in the presence of illness or fertility. So here's a couple of horses like saying hello, how you doing? What's up with you? And detecting each other's emotions. This is done cross species all the time. There's an example of a dog and a horse determining how each is feeling that day. Here's a cat and determining how a human is feeling that day. Here's a dog and a cat picking up on the emotions of each other. And a horse and a dog. Also, licking enhances smell for dogs and cats. And so getting in a little extra lick in there is going to increase the sense of smell because again, that will not only, the smell molecules not only go through the nostrils, but also up and through the mouth and through the Jacobson's organ. And many of you probably know this, but it's always a fun anecdote to share. Dogs, of course, cannot breathe underwater, but underwater, dogs can smell. The water can go through their mouth and touch through the water molecules do not pass through the Jacobson organ, the vimeral nasal organ, but the olfactory molecules are small enough to pass through the vimeral nasal organ. And so that sense of smell can be detected underwater because of that unique capacity of dogs to be able to smell underwater. So here's an example of course, this is a role play. I would never show you faces of real clients, but this is my dog, Jessie, a little blonde Cocker Spaniel, and she's role playing with a couple of my students. Of course, it's never a role play for the animal. It's always real. But this is a moment that I captured on my camera of Jessie doing a check-in with one of my students, and she's come over to sniff the breath to sort of say, hey, well, you know, what emotions are you feeling today? And this is what I would call a checking in charm, a significant human-animal relational moment. And the behavior of the animal following this is going to give me some information about what might be going on with the client. It's also a very endearing, nurturing moment between the client and the therapy animal. In my human animal relational theory, which I put together back in 2015 after 15 years of practicing, observing, supervising, and researching animal-assisted therapy, it's a model to guide people who want to do animal-assisted psychotherapy and how to detect some of the more significant human-animal relational moments and what they might mean, and examples for how to process that with a client. So I've got a resource at the end of the slideshow that with a digital link where you can look up my article that tells you a whole lot more about my human-animal relational theory and the various examples of significant moments that often happen in psychotherapy and how you can process those. Here's an example of a checking in charm in an equine-assisted play therapy session. So the horse is coming over out of curiosity to sniff what the child is playing with, but also to get a sniff of the client. So it's information that the horse is going to use to size up. Yeah, it looks like this is an interesting situation, but also a calming situation, discerning emotion, attitude, behavior of the client, getting a little bit more information. Again, licking is a nurturing behavior. Here's an example between a dog and a person, an example of licking is nurturing between kittens. And finally, let's look at the role of electromagnetic energy. That's kinesthetic pathways. Again, humans can detect energy. You know, you can walk in and sense the energy in a room. Well, animals rely on that a lot. And they're very sensitive to picking up the energy or the electromagnetic energy that's in place in a room. It may not be one of their primary perceptual fields. We're not really sure. We still, how animals perceive things is still somewhat of a mystery, but there's enough veterinary medicine out there and human research to give us some idea that electromagnetic energy does play a role for animals too. They can experience likely some negative energy that's occurring in the room, and they're going to want to deal with that and release that energy right away and or move away from it. They can also experience positive energy and want to be drawn to it. So nerve impulses are actually electrical energy, and they create energy fields around the body and these waves that can travel away from the body. Also, the heart, as we know, generates the largest electromagnetic field in the body. And our thoughts and emotions can affect the heart's magnetic field, which energetically affects those in our environment, whether or not we are conscious of it. So therapy animals can perceive emotions through multiple sensory pathways. Visual, they can see your behavior and want to either be moved towards it or away from it. They can hear through tone of voice. They can taste, especially through smell, as they enhance the olfactory molecules that come through the mouth. Of course, they can smell it through their nose, and they can feel it through the kinesthetic sense of the electromagnetic energy. So the animals are sensing and perceiving all these things in our clients, and then they're responding to them. And so this is how we as psychotherapists who are trained in psychotherapy and also very familiar with the animal behavior, this is how we utilize that very, very useful information that animals provide us. It was much misunderstood before. We just thought, well, okay, having the animal in the room, that's unique, that's fun, okay. And that's still true. But there's so much more going on that we try to help psychotherapists understand today. The animals are detecting so much in our clients, and they're telling us so much about our clients that is useful information. And by sharing that information with a client and processing that with a client, again, we get to greater and greater depths of what is happening in a therapy session. So I'm not quite done, but just to pause for a moment. Major point number one is that the therapy animal behaviors may signal detection of emotions in other beings present. So if the emotion and attitude detected in another being is too intense, the animal may look away or move away, show one of those other displacement signals, calming signals, or alerting signals that may try to de-escalate the situation. If not too intense, they may try to nurture it. If too intense, they may move away from it. They may mirror or signal the distress of the attitude of the client. Or they may interact to nurture. So major point number two, seeking positive social interaction and nurturing is a common behavior for reward. Humans and animals that are mammals frequently seek out positive social interaction, Thrive system, going back to the early start of my presentation. And humans and domesticated animals that are mammals can and do often provide this for one another, the nurturing, turning on that Thrive system. And this contributes greatly to the positive effect of animal-assisted therapy. So let's examine the relational dynamics that are occurring. So we rely on something called psychodynamics in our sessions, in psychotherapy sessions, like to see both the conscious and unconscious motivational forces that are going on in a client's life. And if we can have more of those come to the conscious level for processing, then we'll be able to help the clients understand their situation, manage the situation, will resolve problems and issues, change their directions in their life. So meaningful relational experiences, past and present, are more likely to appear for processing in psychotherapy through human-animal interaction. There's a little diagram I put together to help people who want to understand animal-assisted therapy better. Again, it's the relational process of animal-assisted therapy. And we rely on this relational process, not just that the animals are detecting, but they're increasing a whole lot more of the psychodynamics that are occurring in the session. You've got the relationship of the therapist with the client and the client with the therapist. So the therapist relationship with the client is not the same as the client's relationship with the therapist. They're two different levels of dynamics, but they're interactive. Now that happens whether the animal is present or not, but you bring an animal into the therapy atmosphere, then you also have the relational dynamic of the therapy animal with the client and the client with the therapy animal. But also important is the therapy animal's relationship with the therapist, and the therapist's relationship with the therapy animal is also displayed. Clients will often watch how the therapy animal and therapist interact to understand more about the therapist. Can the therapist be trusted? Does the therapy dog tend to like the therapist? Does the therapist have a good, healthy relationship with the therapy animal? So the clients will make observations about the therapist, therapy animal interaction dynamics and decide, you know, how they feel about that therapist. Can the therapist be trusted? And the therapy animal is also observing the interactions between the client and the therapist. And then the therapist, of course, is observing the interactions between the client and the therapy animal. These can be going on all at the same time also. You can have a therapy animal therapist client interaction all at the same time, which gives you a whole lot of psychodynamics to pay attention to, which is why you need to be a little bit forgiving of yourself as a psychotherapist. You're not going to pick up on everything that's being presented. You try to pick up on as much as possible. But even if you pick up on a whole lot, then you have to discern through your insight and training as a psychotherapist, what do you just notice and keep silent about, and what do you notice and share with your client for processing? Therapy animals are great transitional beings. They make the best therapeutic transitional catalysts because they're affectionate and responsive, unlike toys. And like if you're doing animal play therapy, you know, so the toys are great. They're a transitional object, but they don't respond. It's left up to the imagination, but the animals respond, which gives us more information and also reinforces the client. And they're also genuine and not prejudgmental like most humans. So everything animals do is spontaneous and real and true. And it's much to be relied upon. So animal-assisted therapy means animals assist in the therapy process. They're not just hanging around because they're cute and fuzzy. They actually help us out, but they do so in their natural ways. And they do so because they want to. Again, we do not force them to be there. Sometimes we even help the clients understand, hey, it looks like the rabbit's gone into the corner. They need some space. So we also advocate for the animals to make sure the client understands when the animals need a little space and what that might mean and how does the client feel about that, which is also going to give us some useful information. So it's all up to the animal whether they want to participate or not. But if they do, remember too, an animal is still participating in the session if it's laying asleep on the floor, or if it's gone into the corner, because it's still having an effect on the client. So whether the animal's at a distance or close up or in the lap of a client is still having an effect, an impact, a relational impact on the psychodynamics, the conscious and unconscious motivational forces of a client. I had a client one time who my dog Jessie chose to sit on the floor next to me and not interact with the client, which is very unusual for Jessie, but I always honor what's going on. And the client was looking sad. I said, what's going on? They said, well, Jessie doesn't want to come over to me. And I said, well, what's going on with you that you think that Jessie would rather be with me than with you? And so the client shared that maybe the dog doesn't like them or whatever. And that gave me a chance to process with them their sense of self-esteem. And by processing that, the client started to feel more comfortable with himself. And Jessie actually walked over and crawled into their lap. So we processed what changed, what shifted in the client, that all of a sudden Jessie wanted to come over and lay in their lap. They said, well, I realized it was just really me feeling that way, that I was probably sending these messages out to Jessie that I'm not worthy to be with. So again, we do rely on what's actually true and happening in therapy, but we also rely on the client's imagination of what might be happening in a therapy session, because the way the client projects upon the animal that they believe the animals are responding in a certain way is also a reflection of the client's beliefs and feelings and emotions. So whether it's real or projection, it's still very useful in a psychotherapy session. So what animals detect and share in a session has great relational value. And the more a psychotherapist understands and values what an animal might be telling us, the more useful it is in psychotherapy. So in summary, through natural behaviors associated with a special stress response system and social response system and mirror neurons and the olfactory system, and of course, the magnetic energy system, animals can assist a handler, in this case, a psychotherapist, by revealing and attending to the thrive and survive needs of any human clients in a session. The greatest asset of animals in a psychotherapy session is their relational value, how they want to move in and out of the interaction with the client, and our ability to process this with a client to make it more meaningful to the client's actual life and well-being. So I was supervising a session with one of my supervisees one time. I do a lot of supervision and training, and with permission of the supervisees, the doctoral student was sharing with me a recording of her supervising two students in a session. And one student was on the couch, and the therapy dog Wally was on the couch next to the therapist. And one student supervisee was on the floor getting ready to punch the video of her session that she had just had with a child to talk about it, in supervision. And as the supervising on the floor was sort of setting up the session or explaining what was about to occur, that she was going to show the supervisor and the other supervisees so that they can talk about her counseling skills that she was learning. This conversation was going on. All of a sudden, Wally, who was sitting next to the therapist dog, he sat up And he sort of looked at the therapist and looked back at the supervisee on the floor, and looked at the therapist and looked back at the supervisee on the floor. And kind of nobody was saying anything. So then Wally jumped down off the couch and walked over to the supervisee and sat down next to the supervisee and looked back at the therapist. Nobody was saying anything yet. And looked back at the supervisee and looked back at the therapist, looked back at the supervisee. So remember when I talked about displacement signals, learning signals, calming signal? Wally was talking. He was sharing a lot of information about what he was detecting in that session. And nobody was really attending to it yet. Well, after signaling for maybe 5 minutes, finally Wally did, he went, woof, he barked, woof. Just one quick little woof. And that got everybody's attention. And the supervisor looked at Wally, and the therapist looked at Wally, and the other supervisor in the room on the couch looked at Wally. And that's when it dawned on them, oh, Wally's been talking this whole time and we've been paying attention to him. And so the therapist said, oh, Wally has something to say here. What do you think Wally's saying? And the supervisor on the floor said, yeah, I think I know what that's about. And the supervisor said, well, I'm really, really, really anxious about this parent consultation that I'm supposed to do today. And so the supervisor therapist said, go ahead, tell me about it. And so the supervisor started talking about it and said, well, she's the parent that she's going to consult with that day about, the child she's seen in play therapy reminded her a lot of a situation about a year ago. And that was when she was, and that parent, she was working with a parent in a school. She was a teacher and she was working with that parent in a school. She was doing a parent consult, and she wasn't a counselor yet. She was a teacher. And then she had a quick parent consultation with that parent about her child in the school system, and then learned the next couple of days later that that parent had actually committed suicide. And even though she was not the therapist of that parent, she was just a teacher of that parent's child, she had this irrational guilt about maybe she should have picked up on something, even though she was not the therapist of that parent. But that parent that she was working with on that today in the present, when she was training to be a counselor, reminded her a lot of that parent. And so she was being triggered about that past trauma. And so they were able to process that in the supervision session to help alleviate the supervisee's anxiety. And that never would have come up if Wally hadn't said, there's something going on here that needs attention. And so one of the things that the supervisee, the doctoral student in training, learned as she's training to be a supervisor is that she's got to pay a lot more attention to what's going on, because Wally really didn't need to get to the point of barking. He didn't really need to get to the point of vocalization, because he had already been saying a whole lot about what was going on through his displacement signals and his alerting signals. So that's how we pay attention and process things with our clients, and sometimes with our supervisees in a supervision session, and how the animals can tell us so much more about what's going on, because they can detect so much more. They can smell so much better than we can, and feel the energy in the room so much better than we can. So I hope this has been helpful in understanding how animal-assisted therapy works, animal-assisted psychotherapy works, and how, again, we make sure that everyone's safe, and we attend to the welfare of not only the humans and the animals only participate if they want to. And we value the animals as social beings in a session. And you can see my email up here on the screen. And also, I believe you'll get copies of the slideshows. Here's my book, Animal Assisted Therapy and Counseling, which is fairly popular in the field of psychotherapy. And my article, Human Animal Relational Theory, a guide for animal assisted counseling. And here's the digital link to that. And then, of course, all of the other resources from my slideshow today to back up what I was saying. All right. So any questions?
Okay, thank you so much for the presentation, Professor Chandler. I think because of time, we may not be able to take questions, but let me just quickly read this comment by okay, I won't want to mention the name because I don't know if the person will be okay with it. But then the person said, we discovered that my husband had cancer when our dog suddenly began sniffing his breath and howling. It was such an odd behavior that that after watching it happen a couple of times, it struck me that this might be something that the dog was trying to tell us. As soon as we sent my husband to the doctor and his inoperable lung cancer was discovered. So he had no symptoms to give us warning. So which is a really powerful story as well to share, to talk about what you're talking about, the olfactory this thing and all. So thank you so much for the presentation. There were a good number of questions from the pre-conference question, but thankfully your presentation has done superbly well in answering a number of them. And I especially love the fact that you were able to run through various species, animal species, dogs, horses, cats, and all of that, and then sharing about how they all, the cues and everything that they elicit and all. My Dr. Shidi Willie, who I was privileged to meet in Botswana as well, is here. And like she was commenting, she says, thank you, Prof. So this is a very, okay, she was thanking you for the presentation. And I don't know, but I want to guess that she will probably get in touch with you as well later on. So thank you so very much once more. I think we would have to move to the final presentation now quickly. So the final presentation is by someone who is currently the head of Blue Cross Pet Bereavement Support Service, a free helpline service which supports any type of pet loss by phone, email, and web chat, running for nearly 30 years. This is in the UK. She has experience in training and HR in both private and public sector. She heads a large team of staff and volunteers who are the real heroes of the service. She has experience in public speaking, media work, which includes radio and television, which she enjoys as it makes people aware of the service the charity offers. So to speak on the topic of pet loss and working with loss, please make welcome Diane James.
Thank you. Can you hear me and see me?
Yes, we can.
Right, I'm really conscious of a number of things. One, that everybody's probably talked out and they've heard such a lot. Also the time, but my topic can be quite emotive and sad. So I'm going to try with the deepest respect to tell you all about it in the best way I can. As you said, my name's Diane and I work for Blue Cross. Blue Cross are, just move my slides, there we go. I'm going to talk to you about who we are, really quick brief of grief and a grief cycle, how we support clients and how you can, a bit about self-care, and then a tiny bit about animals grieving in the fastest possible time because I'm conscious of it. We started out as a charity, Blue Cross, in 1897, and one really thing that you might sort of find interesting is that we have possibly what is the world's oldest animal hospital, and it's still going today, and it's in Victoria in London, and it started out treating in those days parrots and monkeys, and today we have mainly cats and dogs, but it's for people on low income and no income. And then just over 29 years ago, along with the wonderful SCAS, the pet bereavement service line was started up, and we help people who've lost any animal. So it can be absolutely anything. We have calls from people who have carp and chickens right up to horses. They ring us for support for their loss. It's a free service, and we communicate with them by phone, email, or web chat. So we try to cover every eventuality that we'll get and every age group. We also provide, as well as that dedicated service, training for a lot of the veterinary colleges in the UK on pet bereavement and how to work with clients, and most importantly, how the effect of pet loss will affect people themselves. And lately, we've started to do a lot more with academic research because there's not a lot of research out there on the effect of the loss of an animal on a human being, or how it affects other animals. And I've also worked with a lot of assistance charities. For example, in the UK, we have guide dogs, we have medical detection dogs, and sadly, these animals will eventually come to the end of their working career or their lives. So we work with those as well. So what we cover within pet loss, everybody always thinks bereavement is death. Sadly, it is for everything. However, we cover euthanasia. So it can be when an animal is diagnosed and a terminal illness, we start to work with the client. If it's got natural causes and it dies, it's involved in an accident. When we talk about ambiguous loss, it's been in this country, we tend to get a lot of animal theft, where people obviously have no closure because they never know what's happened to their animal. And it's a huge increase because of the cost of the animals in this country that people now sadly steal them for others and for breeding. If an animal's lost, it's also another loss. And we're experiencing more and more now people having to relinquish animals for rehoming due to financial reasons or illness, marital separation. So it's a huge raft of things that we cover. So what exactly is pet bereavement and grief? Well, grief is the response to the emotional response to a loss of someone or something that's very important to you, whereas bereavement tends to be the loss of an emotional attachment. So the word loss makes it easier for people to relate to and to understand. So at the moment, we're looking at we're working with a pet loss reform group in this country. We're bringing the word loss into our title so that people understand it means that just as much. So does pet loss differ to human loss? I sometimes hear people get aghast about this. It does differ. However, there is a lot of similarity, but what people sometimes don't understand is I've lost people I love, human beings, and I'm absolutely devastated and miss them every day. I've lost animals, devastated. It's just a different loss for me. However, as Phil talked about earlier, it can be for some people their only companion or their only link to a loved lost one. So when the pet goes, the effect on them is absolutely huge. And we started to look at this within our charity, because when we trained, we tended to use the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross grief cycle, and it was based, if you've ever seen it, on human loss. So while we saw there were some similarities, we also appreciated there were some differences. And as a team, we worked on and we came up with the pet loss stages of grief. And I often joke that it should be called the Diane James, like the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, but it's not. We called it the Blue Cross pet loss stages of grief. Very similar to human loss, except there's one area, and I will pick up on it on the next slide, that's quite unique. As you know, often people go into what we call anticipatory grief. They start to grieve a loss before an animal has died because they start to concentrate on its loss rather than it still being here. So it may be that medically it can be medicated for a long period of time, have a quality of life, but they're already grieving that animal. Guilt we'll touch on the next slide, because guilt forms a huge part of pet loss stages of grief. You may see as well, when somebody's going through grief, human and animal, they often have anger. Now, resentment and anger is a common part of a grief cycle within loss. What we do say, though, is if it's directed at you personally or it's offensive, then it's not acceptable. But it's worth noting that any of these emotions should be acknowledged. We see within the service I run, people from the lowest ebb in their lives, sadly, where they are suffering from depression or even at the lowest point where they're considering suicide because of the loss. And a lot of people find that difficult to understand until they understand that link between the human and animal bond that we've heard about today. And it can be that often that's their only thing in their life. And when that isn't there any longer, they feel they can't go on. So sadly, we do get, and we are seeing an increase in this type of user of our service. What we do hope is that at some point people will be able to re-socialize, relink, may even get a new animal, new pet, and look forward. But as you know, nothing is ever in that way. Nothing is ever linear, nothing runs as it should be. So that's the pet loss stages of grief that we worked on for a long while so we could show people how grief worked. Now, when I talked about guilt, it's very common in animal loss, particularly because obviously an animal has no verbal consent. Although we can obviously know our own animals and pets and we can see things when their condition changes or they're in pain, we are responsible for that welfare of that animal. So people feel guilty when they get the timing wrong. So for example, were they too late? Were they too soon? Could they have a second opinion? So as human beings, we tend to find that the guilt is different in that sense to human loss. Also, we get a lot of comments from people about how they feel when they have to sign the paperwork or the administration for the euthanasia of a pet. Common comments you get are, it's like signing a death warrant, or I feel personally responsible. So that's where all this guilt then starts to come in. And responsibility grief is a huge one with animal owners. They themselves will start to take the responsibility, but often you'll see it passed back to the caregivers. So people within animal welfare or the veterinary world will see that people will then turn around and start to blame them when there was no more they could actually do, but it's all part of that person's guilt. So the way to retain clients and to support clients, it's really important because sometimes people will associate buildings or premises where they've taken their pets for euthanasia or treatment, and they will then not return because they associate that memory with it. And it's something that we see an awful lot of. No matter how good the service, if you communicate or you don't communicate, or the person has bad memories, they then won't return. So retaining people within it and making sure that it's the best possible way that we can work with them is vitally important. So we talk and we say about having a compassionate approach. I'm sorry if I'm talking fast, it's not intentional. It's because I'm from Wales in England. We always say to people, it's important that people listen more than they speak. And by that, it's sometimes when people get bad news, they go into what we call a heightened state of awareness. They'll only hear certain things that you say to them. And often they will start to ramble or talk about memories or particular ways of their pet may behave. And sometimes this is the only way they can get out of their system. When we say about being empathetic, not sympathetic, this always applies to pet loss. Being empathetic means that we will see it through the client's eyes and see how they feel. Sympathy means we will often interject how we feel or how we see it. So it's really important that we answer their questions as well when they have them honestly, and we don't use jargon. By that, often we find people use abbreviations or terminology or medical terms. Thinking about having the right space to have that conversation. If you haven't got purpose-built premises and you're working in an environment that is quite difficult to work within, then you need to avoid things like distractions, give them your time, don't make them feel rushed, and allow them space to work. Now I'm going to turn my camera off, I'm sorry, because I've got a bit of an unstable connection with you. So I'm going to stop my video, but I will still be here. So don't let them feel rushed into making a decision. Giving them all the time in the world is really important. Often people say to me, what can I do to make it better for the person? The most important thing is you never promise to fix. And I know that we don't, but sometimes we hope that we'll do our best, but we can't always solve the solutions or give them the things that they need. So
I can't seem to hear you, Diane. Are you still there?
I think her internet went off. She complained that she was going to put off her video.
Yeah. Okay, maybe just a minute more to see if she's able to get back in.
Yeah.
Anyway, while we wait for her, thank you so much, everyone who's been able to attend so far, and for some of the comments in the comment section, comments for all the speakers and all of that. Thank you so much. And for all the speakers, thank you so much for availing yourself for all the information you're sharing. Much of the information that has been shared even here today is stuff that is to a large extent new for many people that are attending the conference. There are a lot of people who are hearing all of this for the first time and had not had any previous experience or had not encountered this before. So thank you so very much for everything I've shared. And I loved the level of simplicity and the way it was broken down in all the presentations. Like I was saying to Professor Cynthia Chandler just now, I love the fact that she was able to, for example, go through a number of species and how that is really helpful. I know that for the event today, we do have a number of psychologists, a number of human service professionals, especially psychologists. We personally went out of the way to make sure that we were going to invite a good number of human service professionals, psychologists, psychiatrists, all from Nigeria and South Africa. Dr. Shidi really also helped to invite a good number of them as well from Botswana. She herself is, so I'm sure Bibi gets to benefit a whole lot from Professor Cynthia Chandler's presentation as well as all the others. So thank you all so much. If Diane does not come back on, we may have to end the session. Let me see. Okay. So it's so great to have you all here. Thank you all so much. And Jim Stevens says, an excellent afternoon of presentations. Looking forward to tomorrow. Yes, thank you so much. So in the absence of Diane being able to back, sorry,
please, can we get the materials of this presentation later?
Yes, the videos will be, the links to the videos will be sent to everyone who did register. So thank you.
I mean the material.
Yes.
Those are slides.
Yes, we'll request. Yes, we'll send the slides as well.
Thank you.
Okay.
It's a
Thank you so
good
much.
presentation. Thanks for bringing this up. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Welcome. So we'll stop the recording at this point.